Calder Renford stepped out of his hired coach in front of the Iron Creek Ranch gate, straightened his coat, and told Silas's foreman, a man who had worked that land for 9 years, that he had 72 hours to clear his belongings off the property. He didn't say it quietly. He said it loud enough for every hand in the yard to hear, loud enough for the children playing near the cabin to stop and look. Then he turned toward the small line cabin at the edge of the property, where a widow and her 3 children had been living, and said something that made 3 ranch hands take a step forward without thinking. "And get that squatter and her litter off my uncle's land before I have the sheriff do it." He hadn't bought a single acre yet. He just wanted everyone to know that he intended to. If you've ever watched someone treat human beings like obstacles in a ledger, you know exactly the kind of cold that settled over Iron Creek Ranch that afternoon. If that kind of story reaches something in you, the kind where the person everyone counted out refuses to stay counted, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Gee. The storm announced itself the way Wyoming storms always did. Not with rain, not with thunder, but with a stillness so complete that even the horses went quiet. Everett Calloway had been riding the eastern fence line for the better part of an hour, checking for breaks after 3 days of hard wind, when the stillness hit him. He pulled his horse to a stop, stood in the stirrups, and looked northwest. The sky had gone the color of a bad bruise, greenish at the edges, almost black at the center. And it was moving fast. Too fast. He turned his horse toward the main road and pushed the animal into a lope. He wasn't supposed to be on this road. The shorter route back to Iron Creek Ranch ran along the creek bed, but the creek had flooded 2 days ago, and Everett had spent enough years in this territory to know that a flooded creek bottom and a sky that color belonged in the same sentence about bad decisions. So, he took the long way, which ran past the open ground south of Red Hollow, where a few displaced families had been camping since late summer. He almost didn't see it. The camp, if you could call it that, sat back from the road behind a stand of cottonwoods. Most nights he'd passed it without stopping, catching only a glimpse of firelight through the trees. Tonight the firelight was out, and what he saw instead was a canvas tent in the process of tearing itself apart. One of the corner stakes had already pulled free. The front panel was snapping back and forth in the rising wind like something trying to escape. And standing in front of it, one arm around a tiny girl and one arm hurting 2 older children against her hip, was a woman in a patched brown coat who was watching her shelter disintegrate and hadn't moved. Everett couldn't tell from the road whether she was frozen in fear or calculating options. He pulled his horse off the road anyway. "Ma'am," he called out, loud enough to carry over the wind. She turned, and then she raised a revolver and pointed it at the center of his chest. Everett stopped his horse about 30 feet out. He kept his hands where she could see them, loose and open, resting on the saddle horn. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't back up either. "I'm not here to bother you," he said. "Storm's coming in fast. That canvas isn't going to hold." "I know that," the woman said. Her voice was steady in a way that told him it was costing her something to keep it that way. The revolver didn't waver. "You can keep riding. You got somewhere to take the children?" Silence. The wind picked up. A second tent stake pulled from the ground with a wet, tearing sound, and the front panel snapped outward and cracked like a whip. The little girl pressed her face against the woman's ribs. "We'll manage," the woman said. "I don't doubt that normally," Everett said. He glanced at the sky. "But you've got about 20 minutes before that hits, and it's carrying hail. I can hear it from here." He couldn't, actually, but he'd seen enough storms to know this one would. The older boy, he looked to be about 6, maybe 7, tugged at the woman's coat. "Mama," he said. Just that. Just the word. The woman didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Everett, reading him the way people read strangers when the stakes are too high to be wrong. Everett waited. "Keep the gun," he said finally. "I'm not asking you to put it down, but those children are sleeping under a roof tonight." He said it plain, without making it into a command or a mercy. He said it like a fact, like a thing that was simply going to happen, and he meant for her to decide whether she was going to be part of it or whether the children were going to watch him figure out another way. The woman's jaw tightened. The tent chose that moment to surrender completely. The remaining stakes ripped free simultaneously, and the canvas rose into the air like a ghost, cartwheeled twice, and disappeared into the cottonwoods. What it left behind was a cleared patch of dirt, a small iron pot, a canvas sack that had been tied to one of the poles, and 3 children who stood in the open wind staring at the sky where their shelter used to be. The little girl started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just a thin, tired sound, like she'd been waiting a long time to have a reason. The woman lowered the revolver. "We've got a line cabin 3 miles out," Everett said. "Belongs to Iron Creek Ranch. It's empty. There's a stove, a wood pile, blankets." He paused. "I'll ride ahead and open it up. You follow in the wagon." "We don't have a wagon." Everett looked at the camp again. No wagon, no animals. A pot, a sack, a bedroll that had already blown 20 feet into the trees. "Then the children ride with me," he said. "You walk alongside. I'm not putting my children on a horse with a man I don't know. Then you ride, and I'll walk." She stared at him. "Pick one," he said, "but pick fast." Her name was Mara Ellison, and she told him that much and nothing else during the 3-mile walk to the cabin. She rode his horse, he walked. The 2 older children, Lucy and Ben, she said their names like she was testing whether he would bother to remember them, sat in front of her in the saddle, and the youngest, Nell, slept against Mara's chest with one fist wrapped in her mother's coat collar. The hail started before they reached the cabin. Not heavy at first, just small pieces, the size of peas, clicking against the rocks and the hard ground. Everett kept his head down and his hand on the horse's lead and kept moving. "You're going to have bruises tomorrow," Mara said from above him. "Probably," he said. "You didn't have to walk." "No." She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. The cabin was where he'd left it 2 weeks ago when he'd checked the fence line, unlocked, cold, with a stack of split wood beside the stove and 2 oil lamps on the shelf. He got the lamps lit first, then the stove, then he went outside for more wood while Mara settled the children onto the 2 cots against the wall. The hail had gotten serious by the time he came back in with his second armload, and he was bleeding a little from one ear where a larger piece had caught him on the side of the head. Mara saw it when he set the wood down. She didn't say anything. She opened the canvas sack she'd carried the whole way, took out a folded cloth that had clearly been repurposed from something else, and held it out to him. "I'm fine," he said. "You're dripping on the floor," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She pressed the cloth against the cut and held it there without fuss, without commentary, the way someone acts when they've done a lot of practical things under pressure and stopped thinking of any of it as extraordinary. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since August," he calculated. "That's almost 4 months. I know how long it is. Where'd your husband—" "He died in September." She said it like she'd said it 100 times, which she probably had. "Fever, 3 days after we made camp." She pulled the cloth back, checked the cut, pressed it again. "We came out from Ohio. He had a plan for a property claim. The property turned out to belong to someone else already, and then he got sick before we could figure out the next step." "You didn't go back east?" "On what?" "The wagon went to pay the doctor. The oxen went 2 weeks later when we needed to eat." She pulled the cloth away again. "It stopped. Don't touch it." He didn't touch it. The children were already asleep, all 3 of them piled together on one cot with the ranch blanket Everett had found in the storage chest, and they were out completely. The sudden, total sleep of people who have been using everything they have just to stay upright. Mara sat on the edge of the other cot and looked at them for a long moment. "I went to every house in Red Hollow," she said quietly. "Every merchant, 3 of the ranch houses. I can sew, I can cook, I can keep accounts, I have decent handwriting, I can manage a garden. I told them all of it." She paused. "Mrs. Harriet Conley at the dry goods told me a widow with 3 children would be more trouble than help. The Dawson Ranch foreman said they'd take me on, but the children would need to stay somewhere else." Her voice stayed level. A man I won't name made it clear what kind of arrangement he was actually offering. Everett said nothing. "So we stayed in the tent," Mara said. "I took in mending when I could get it. Lucy walks into town twice a week and asks. Sometimes people have work, mostly they don't." She looked at him directly for the first time since they'd come inside. "I know what you're thinking." "You don't know what I'm thinking. You're thinking there must have been something else I could have done." "I'm thinking," Everett said, "that Red Hollow ought to be ashamed of itself." She blinked, just once, but it was the first unguarded thing he'd seen from her. "This is Iron Creek property," she said after a moment. "Silas Renford's land." "Yes." "He's going to want you to move us out in the morning." "Possibly." "Then what was the point?" Everett reached over and added a piece of wood to the stove. "The point was that it's tonight," he said, "and tonight the children aren't sleeping in a field." Silas Renford was 61 years old, barrel-chested, and had a face like leather left in the sun too long. He'd built Iron Creek Ranch from a single cabin and a contested water claim into one of the most productive spreads in the territory, and he'd done it by being practical above all other things. He wasn't a warm man. He wasn't a cold one either. He was a man who looked at situations and asked what they cost and what they produced, and he tried to make the arithmetic come out right. He was eating breakfast when Everett came in and told him about the woman and the children in the line cabin. Silas put his fork down. "The tent's gone," Everett said. "Storm took the whole thing. She's got nowhere to go back to." "Red Hollow's got a women's charity committee," Silas said. "I know. They help people in situations like this." Mrs. Ellison went to them in September. They told her they didn't have capacity for a family of 4. Everett poured himself a coffee and stayed standing. "I'm not asking you to keep her permanently. I'm asking for 30 days. Trial arrangement. She works for what she uses." Silas picked up his fork again, set it back down. "Doing what?" "She sews. She keeps accounts. She said she can manage a household inventory. I have Dolly doing that. Dolly's been asking to go live with her daughter in Cheyenne since June, and you know it." Silas's jaw moved. "What do the children do?" "The boy has a feel for horses. I saw it last night walking in." He was watching every movement mine made. He's 6 years old, and he was reading that animal. Everett set his cup down. "The older girl could help around the house. The youngest is 3. She doesn't do much yet. You're asking me to take on a widow and 3 children based on a walk home in a hailstorm. I'm asking you to give her 30 days to show you what she can do. If it doesn't work, I'll find her another arrangement myself." Everett met the older man's eyes. "I've been your foreman for 9 years, Silas. I've asked you for 3 things in 9 years. This is the 3rd. Silas looked at him for a long time. 30 days, he said finally. "She uses the line cabin and the kitchen garden. She takes her meals separately. If she's not worth the arrangement in 30 days, she goes, and you handle it." "Fair enough," Everett said. "And Everett." Silas picked up his fork again. "She keeps the gun. I don't want any of the hands getting ideas." Mara had already been awake for 2 hours when Everett came back to the cabin. She'd built the fire up, found a broom in the corner, and swept the floor, discovered a crate of supplies that had been left by the last hand to use the cabin, and was making a careful list of contents in a small notebook she produced from somewhere inside her coat. The children were awake too. Lucy was folding blankets with the serious concentration of a child who had learned that helping was how you earned your place. Ben was crouched near the window watching a ranch dog that had come to investigate, completely still, his weight forward on his toes. Nell was eating a cold biscuit she had apparently found on her own initiative and was showing no interest in sharing. 30-day trial, Everett said when Mara looked up. "You work for what you use. Sewing, inventory, whatever Silas needs managing around the house. The cabin's yours for the duration." "And after 30 days? You prove yourself. It extends." Mara closed the notebook. "I'll need thread. Good thread. Not the cheap kind that breaks on heavy fabric. And sharp needles. At least a dozen different gauges. And a second lamp. This one doesn't put out enough light to work by in the evenings." "I'll get them. I'm not asking for charity," she said. "Add it to what I owe. I'll work it off." "I know you will," Everett said. Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully, the way she'd looked at him on the road the night before, reading, measuring. Whatever she found, she didn't show. "We'll need to discuss what I'm owed in return," she said. "Daily rate or piece rate? I prefer piece rate. It rewards faster work." "I'll talk to Silas." "Talk to him today. I'd like to start this afternoon." Everett almost smiled. He managed not to. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Lucy looked up from the blankets. "Are we staying?" she asked. Mara glanced at her daughter. "For now," she said. Ben didn't look away from the dog. "The dog's scared of something," he said quietly. "His left ear's been bitten before. See how he holds it lower than the right? He's waiting to see if it's safe." Everett looked at the boy, then at the dog, then back at the boy. "You're right," he said. "What do you think would make him feel safe?" Ben considered this with the gravity of someone much older than 6. "Probably if we just stayed still for a while," he said, "and didn't try to make him come closer." "That's good thinking," Everett said. Bun finally looked up. "I know," he said, simply. Without arrogance, just a child who understood one thing clearly and had no reason to pretend otherwise. The first week was an audition that nobody admitted was an audition. Mara worked from first light until the lamp ran low. She repaired 3 shirts that had been waiting since spring, re-stitched a saddle blanket that had been pulling apart at the seams, and hemmed 4 pairs of trousers that had been taken in by some previous arrangement and never finished. On the 4th day, she asked Silas, through Everett, whether she could inventory the storage room. Silas said yes, expecting it to take a week. It took her a day and a half. She produced a written list organized by category and quantity, with a separate column noting what needed to be replaced and what could be repaired rather than discarded. At the bottom, she had added a rough calculation of what the repair column would save against replacement cost. Silas read it twice. "The woman has a business mind," he told Everett that evening. "Yes," Everett said. "She does. She's also watching everything. Yes. The hands are noticing her. The hands are behaving themselves," Everett said flatly. Silas gave him a long look. "That's because you told them to. I told them she was here to work and she was to be treated accordingly, same as I'd say about anyone." "It's not quite the same," Silas said, "and you know it." Everett said nothing. "She's not a charity case," Silas said. "I'll tell you that plainly. She's producing more in a week than Dolly has in a month, and Dolly is a good woman. Whatever else this arrangement is, and I'm not saying it's anything, it's not charity." "No," Everett said, "it isn't." He went back to the bunkhouse and didn't think about Mara Ellison for the rest of the evening. He was mostly successful. Lucy started at the settlement school on the Monday of the 2nd week. Mara walked her in herself all the way to the schoolroom door and stood in the doorway until Lucy had found a seat, and the teacher, a thin young man named Aldridge, who was clearly managing more children than he'd been told to expect, had acknowledged her with a nod. Then she walked back to the ranch, 4 miles round trip. She did it every morning for a week before Everett found out, because Lucy hadn't mentioned it and Mara certainly hadn't. "I can have one of the hands take her on horseback," he said, when he caught Mara heading back up the road one Tuesday morning. "She doesn't need a horse. She needs the walk," Mara said, without stopping. "It's 4 miles. "I know how far it is. Why does she need the walk?" Mara did stop then. She turned around. "Because she's 8 years old and she spent 4 months being afraid, and the walk gives her time to get her head right before she has to sit in a room full of strangers and pretend she's fine." She paused. "And I walk with her because it gives me the same thing." Everett looked at her. "You could ride alongside," he said. "Keep her company without having to walk both ways." "I walk back alone," Mara said. "That part is mine." He watched her go. He thought about that for a long time afterward. The precision of it, the clarity. She knew exactly what she needed and why she needed it, and she had simply told him. Without apology, without performance, without any interest in whether he found it remarkable or strange. He was starting to understand that this was simply how Mara Ellison moved through the world. She knew the cost of things. She knew the value of things. And she drew a very clean line between the two. By the end of the 2nd week, Ben had become a quiet fixture around the corral. He didn't ask to help. He didn't get in the way. He simply appeared at the fence every morning after breakfast, perched on the top rail, and watched. The hands had tried to chase him off twice, and both times Everett had told them to let him be. On the 12th day, a young gelding that had been brought in from a neighboring property came in badly spooked. Something had happened on the road, nobody was sure what, and the animal arrived rolling its eyes and refusing to settle. 2 experienced hands tried to work with it and got nowhere. The horse kept circling, kept throwing its head, kept backing into the fence with its ears flat. Ben watched from his rail. After about 20 minutes, he climbed down. He walked to the fence gate, not the horse, and stood there, not looking at the horse directly, not making any move toward it, just standing, weight balanced, arms loose at his sides. The gelding noticed him. The circling slowed. Ben didn't move. The horse turned to face him. Ben waited. After 4 minutes that nobody counted but everyone measured, the gelding walked across the corral and put its nose an inch from Ben's chest and blew out a long, slow breath. Ben raised one hand very slowly and laid it flat against the animal's jaw. The horse stood still. One of the hands, a 20-year veteran named Price who had seen more horses than most people saw people, took off his hat and stared. "How old is that kid?" he said to Everett. 6, Everett said. Price put his hat back on. "God help us," he said, but not unhappily. Mara heard about it from Lucy, who'd heard it from one of the kitchen women, who'd apparently heard Price telling it to every person on the property. She found Everett at the tool shed that evening. "Ben can't work with the horses," she said. "He's 6 years old." "Nobody's putting him to work," Everett said. "He just stands at the fence. People are talking about it. People are impressed by it. That's the same thing, she said. Impress people, make plans. I don't want anyone making plans about my son. Everett set down the piece of harness he'd been oiling. Mara, he has a gift. That's a rare thing. I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. He's a child. Yes, and when he's not a child anymore, that gift could make his life. He held her gaze. Nobody's taking anything from him. I just want to make sure nobody closes a door on something that ought to stay open. She was quiet for a moment. He used to do it with the pigs on my father's farm, she said finally. When he was 3, the sow didn't like anyone near the piglets. Let Ben sit right next to her. She said this without sentiment, just as a fact. My father said it was a nuisance and eventually the pig would bite him. Did she? No. Mara turned to go. But my father wasn't wrong that it was a nuisance. Things you're good at have a way of creating complications. Everett watched her walk back toward the cabin. Yes, he said, to no one. They do. The first time Red Hollow talked, it came through the dry goods. Mara had gone in on a Thursday. Lucy at school, Ben at the fence, Nell on her hip, to purchase thread and pay for the order she'd placed the week before. She had the exact amount, counted out in advance, and she set it on the counter in front of Mrs. Conley with the receipt she'd kept. Mrs. Conley took the money. Then she said, in the particular voice of a woman who wants it known that she's only observing, I see you've settled yourself out at Iron Creek. I'm working there, Mara said. Mrs. Conley put the coins away. Everett Calloway is a respected man. Always has been. He's the foreman, Mara said. I work for Mr. Renford. Of course. Mrs. Conley produced the thread and set it on the counter. It's just, people notice things. A widow woman out at a ranch and a single man. I keep ledgers and mend clothing, Mara said. I work piece rate. I have receipts for everything I've been paid and everything I've spent. If anyone in this town would like to review them, I'll make them available. She picked up the thread. Good afternoon, Mrs. Conley. She walked out. Nell, who had understood none of this but had clearly sensed the temperature of it, patted Mara's cheek with one small hand as they stepped back into the street. Good, Nell said, approvingly. Thank you, Mara said. She told Everett about it that evening, not because she wanted sympathy, but because she decided he had a right to know since his name had been used. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your fault people talk. No, but it's my fault I didn't consider it. He leaned against the cabin door frame. I should have thought ahead. I could have had Silas put something in writing, official work arrangement, documented. Document wouldn't stop the talk. No, but it would give you something to point at. He thought for a moment. There's something else you could do. What? Post a rate sheet, he said. Right here, on this door. Fixed prices for what you sew. Open to anyone in Red Hollow. They want their shirts mended. They pay the same as the ranch hands pay. Everything above board, everything documented. You stop being a woman living on ranch charity and become a woman running a business. He paused. Red Hollow can either be your customers or your critics. Make it harder to be both. Mara was quiet. Then she said, I'll need a better lamp. I'll bring you 2, he said. She looked at him for a moment. That reading look again. The one she used on everything that mattered. You think this town is going to come to a tent widow for sewing work, she said. I think this town has 30 families with mending piling up and nowhere good to take it since Martha Dreyer moved to Casper. He met her eyes. Yes, I think they'll come. Mara turned back into the cabin. I'll write the rate sheet tonight, she said. Lucy, who had been listening from the far cot with her knees pulled up and a book open on them that she had not been reading for at least 10 minutes, looked up. Mama, she said, is Calloway going to be our friend? Mara didn't answer right away. She was already reaching for her notebook. He's already been useful, she said finally. We'll see about the rest. Lucy considered this seriously. Then she nodded as though it was the most reasonable answer she'd heard in months and went back to pretending to read. The rate sheet went up on the cabin door the next morning. The first customer arrived by noon. By the end of the week, there were 6. And somewhere inside Mara Ellison, behind all the calculation and the careful management and the daily arithmetic of survival, something she had stopped believing in, something small and guarded and almost entirely extinguished, turned toward the warmth very slowly. Not quickly, not dramatically, just the way a thing does when it's been cold for a long time, and it finally recognizes that the cold might not be permanent after all. The rate sheet stayed on the cabin door through the first frost, through 2 snowstorms, and through the particular kind of cold that settled into the Wyoming territory in early November and didn't apologize for itself. By the time the ground was frozen solid enough that you could hear it ring when a horse crossed the yard, Mara had 12 regular customers and a waiting list for holiday mending that she'd written in the back of her ledger in her small, precise hand. She hadn't expected the waiting list. She'd prepared for failure, or at least for the slower version of it, the kind where things don't quite work and you have to adjust. She hadn't prepared for success because success had stopped feeling like something she was owed a long time ago, somewhere between Ohio and Wyoming, between a husband with plans and a grave with a wooden marker she'd made herself because nobody else was going to do it. But the customers came. Tentatively at first, a ranch wife who needed curtains hemmed and was clearly using the curtains as an excuse to satisfy her curiosity about the widow at Iron Creek. Then a hand from a neighboring spread who'd heard about Mara's work from Price, who apparently talked about her the same way he talked about Ben and the horses, with a kind of odd practicality, like he'd witnessed something useful and felt an obligation to spread the word. Then Mrs. Hargreave from the Mercantile, who arrived on a Wednesday with a coat that needed its collar reset and who stayed for 40 minutes looking at Mara's work samples and left with a 6-piece order and a slightly dazed expression. "She's good," Mrs. Hargreave told her husband that evening. "Everyone says so," he said. "No, I mean, she's really good. She's not just competent, she makes it right. The collar on that coat has been wrong for 2 years, and every seamstress I've taken it to has just re-sewn it the same wrong way." She paused. "This woman looked at it for 30 seconds and told me what the original cutter had done wrong." By December, Mara had moved her work table closer to the window for the light and pushed the second cot against the wall to give herself room. Lucy had taken over the task of logging orders in the ledger because her handwriting was neater than her mother's, and she understood, at 8 years old, that being useful was not the same as being used, a distinction Mara had been teaching by example since before Lucy could read. Nell had stopped asking when they were going home. That particular question had come up regularly during the first weeks at the cabin, sometimes twice a day, delivered with the insistent patience of a 3-year-old who believes repetition is its own argument. Mara had answered it the same way each time, soon. Then, "We're figuring it out." Then, one evening when Nell asked it while climbing into bed, Mara had sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her youngest for a long moment and said, "We're working on it, Nell. The answer might change." Nell had looked back at her with the particular unblinking attention that small children deploy when they're deciding whether an adult answer is honest or not. "Is this better than the tent?" Nell asked. "Yes," Mara said. "It is." "Then maybe the answer should change," Nell said, and pulled the blanket up and went to sleep. Mara had sat there for a while after that, listening to all 3 of them breathe. She hadn't cried. She was past the point where crying helped. But she had stayed there until the lamp burned low, and she thought about Ohio and about Thomas and about the particular cruelty of a man dying before his plans could either succeed or fail, leaving everyone who'd followed him to find out on their own which it would have been. Thomas Ellison had been a good man with bad timing. Mara had loved him honestly, which was the best she could say about any of it. He'd believed in the West the way some men believed in an idea, completely, without reservation, without quite enough examination of the details. And she'd come with him because that was what you did, and because part of her had believed too. The part that was tired of her father's farm and her mother's careful silence, and a life measured out in seasons that all looked the same. The West had not been what either of them expected. But then neither, she was starting to think, was this. The 30-day trial became 60 without anyone saying so out loud. Silas Renford simply stopped mentioning an end date, and Mara stopped waiting for one. She had begun keeping the household accounts in addition to her sewing work. Silas had asked, a little gruffly, if she'd be willing, and she'd said yes without making anything of it. And the combination of the 2 things was giving her a picture of Iron Creek Ranch that was more complete than anything Silas had probably intended to show a woman he'd agreed to take on as a temporary arrangement. The ranch was solvent. It was more than solvent. It was productive, well-managed, running on Everett's particular talent for quiet efficiency. But it was also aging. The north pasture fence needed replacing, not patching. The barn roof had a section that would not survive another heavy winter. 2 of the line cabins, not hers, the ones to the east, were in conditions that would require serious attention before they could be used again. and the supply agreements Silas had in place with the Red Hollow merchants were organized by habit rather than by price comparison, which meant the ranch was probably paying 12 to 15% more than it needed to on basic goods. Mara noted all of this in the accounts without comment for 3 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, she put together a single sheet of paper, calculations on one side, recommendations on the other, and left it on Silas's desk with a note that said she wasn't asking for anything, she was just putting down what she'd noticed, and he could do with it whatever he wanted. Silas read it at breakfast the next morning. He read it twice. Then he went and found Everett. "Did you ask her to do this?" he said. Everett looked at the paper. "No." "She'd do it on her own?" "Apparently." Silas set it on the table between them. "She's identified 4 supply contracts we can renegotiate and 2 repairs we can defer if we do the preventive work now instead of waiting." He tapped the sheet. "She's right on all of it. I've been looking at the barn roof for 2 years and telling myself it could wait." "Can it?" "Not if she's done this math correctly." He looked at Everett. "She's not a seamstress." "No," Everett said. "She's not." "What is she then?" Everett picked up his coffee. "I think she's whatever the situation calls for," he said. "She's just never had a situation that called for much." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the sheet again and folded it carefully. "I'm going to implement 3 of these 4 recommendations before spring," he said. "I'll tell her through you." "You could tell her yourself," Everett said. Silas gave him a look. "One thing at a time, Calloway." Red Hollow made its second move in late November, and this time it came from a direction Mara hadn't been watching. She'd been careful about the social geography of the town. Careful, the way you are when you've been burned once, and you understand that the fire doesn't always announce itself before it catches. She'd kept her interactions at the dry goods professional and brief. She'd smiled at people on the street without encouraging extended conversation. She'd made sure Lucy understood that school was for learning and not for discussing the family's circumstances with other children, which Lucy had absorbed with the pragmatic dignity of a child who'd learned to read a room before she learned to read a book. What Mara hadn't calculated for was Judith Ames. Judith was the wife of the town's only lawyer, a tall, sharp-faced woman in her late 40s who sat on the charity committee, ran the women's social club, and had an opinion on every family in the territory that she delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong in her own estimation. She had been part of the committee that turned Mara away in September. Mara knew this because Mrs. Conley had mentioned it, not as an apology, just as a fact, the way people mention things they want acknowledged without taking responsibility for. Judith arrived at the cabin on a Thursday afternoon without sending word ahead. She knocked twice, briskly, and when Mara opened the door, she looked past her at the interior of the cabin with the particular expression of someone cataloging what they see and saving it for later. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I'm Judith Ames. I believe we haven't been formally introduced." "We haven't," Mara said. She didn't step back from the doorway. "Can I help you?" "I wanted to see your work, actually. Mrs. Hargreaves spoke highly of your collar repair. I have a jacket that needs attention." Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped aside and let her in. Judith came in, looked around again, at the work table, the ledger, the rate sheet tacked to the inside of the door, the children. Lucy was reading. Ben was outside. Nell was asleep on the cot, one arm thrown over a rag doll she'd acquired from somewhere that Mara had decided not to investigate too closely. "Cozy," Judith said, in a voice that used the word without meaning it. "It works," Mara said. "The jacket?" Judith produced it from the bag she was carrying. It was a good wool jacket, well made, with a seam on the left shoulder that had pulled open and been badly repaired at least once before. The thread was the wrong weight and the stitches were too long. Mara took it and examined it without sitting down. 2 days, she said. I need to remove the previous repair first. The stitching pattern on this weave is specific. If you do it wrong, it pulls the surrounding fabric. She turned the jacket over, and the lining is coming loose at the hem. I can do both. How much? Mara gave her the number. Judith didn't flinch, which meant it was less than she'd expected. Mara had been careful about her prices. Fair, not cheap, not inflated. She'd set them at the rate she'd have charged in a city, adjusted slightly for what the market here would bear, and she hadn't moved them since opening, regardless of what she suspected customers might pay. Fine, Judith said. She didn't leave immediately. She stood looking at the work table instead. You have a good number of orders. Yes. More than I'd have expected, for someone who's only been here since October. November, actually, Mara said. We arrived at the cabin in November. But you were in the territory before that. We were camped outside of town since August, which your committee knew about. Mara set the jacket on the work table and looked at Judith directly. I came to the committee in September. I was told there was no capacity. Judith's expression didn't change exactly. Something in it shifted. A small adjustment, like someone resetting their footing. The committee's resources are limited, she said. I understand that, Mara said. I'm not bringing it up as a complaint. I'm bringing it up because you mentioned being surprised at how much work I have, and I thought you might like the full picture. Silence. Lucy turned a page. The fire cracked. You're very direct, Judith said. I have 3 children and limited time, Mara said. Yes. Judith looked at her for a long moment. Then, and this was the thing Mara hadn't expected, she almost smiled. The jacket will be ready in 2 days. Thursday morning, Mara said. I'll send word if anything changes. Judith picked up her bag. I'll tell the Women's Social Club about your work, she said at the door. We're planning our winter gathering, and there are several women who've been looking for a competent seamstress. I'd appreciate that, Mara said. After Judith left, Lucy looked up from her book. Did that go well? She asked. I think so, Mara said. Probably. You were pretty sharp with her. She came in and looked at everything like she was making a list. She was, Lucy said, with the certainty of a child who was an excellent reader of rooms. But I think you passed. Mara looked at her daughter, this serious-faced girl who had been quietly watching adults for months and cataloging what she learned. You're too perceptive for 8, Mara said. You keep saying that, Lucy said, and went back to her book. Everett brought the firewood on Thursdays. This was not unusual. Someone from the ranch brought firewood to the line cabins on a rotating schedule, and the cabin Mara occupied was on that rotation. But somewhere around the 4th week, Everett had started taking the Thursday round himself, and he hadn't said anything about it, and neither had Mara, and the hands who noticed it had learned quickly from Price's expression that it was not a subject for commentary. He usually came in the late afternoon after the day's main work was done. He'd stack the wood beside the cabin door, check the stove for any issues, sometimes accept a cup of coffee and sometimes not. They'd talk about the ranch, about what Mara had observed in the accounts, about Ben and the horses, about what Lucy was learning at the settlement school. It was the kind of conversation that sounds like nothing in particular if you describe it, but has a particular weight when you're inside it. One Thursday in early December, the coffee was particularly bad. Mara had run out of good coffee 3 days ago and had been stretching the last of the poor quality stuff she'd found in the back of the supply crate since October. It tasted like burned grain and regret, and she knew it, and she put a cup in front of Everett without comment. He took 1 sip. He didn't say anything. He took a 2nd sip. I'll bring coffee, he said. I didn't ask for coffee. I know. He set the cup down. Consider it a business expense. I'm part of the ranch management, and you're keeping the ranch accounts. We should both have functional brains. Mara looked at him over the rim of her own cup. That is a very creative justification. I've been thinking about it since the 2nd sip, he said. She put her cup down. Everett, something in her voice made him pay attention. People are talking, she said, about you specifically, about the firewood, about the Thursday visits. Mrs. Conley mentioned it to me yesterday. Not directly. She mentioned it the way she mentions things, sideways, so she can say later she wasn't gossiping. Everett was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do about it? I want to know if it bothers you. Does it bother you? I asked first, she said. He leaned back in the chair, the one he'd fixed in October, the one where the left front leg had been cracked and wobbling since before Mara arrived, which she'd mentioned once and then never mentioned again, and which he'd repaired on his own initiative during a Tuesday visit when she was walking Lucy to school. It doesn't bother me, he said. People talk. They were talking about you before I started bringing firewood. Yes, Mara said, but then they were talking about me. Now they're talking about us. The word landed between them. Everett didn't look away from it. Mara, I'm not saying anything is wrong, she said quickly. I'm saying I want to know where you stand, because I have 3 children and I can't afford to misread a situation. He was quiet for long enough that the fire settled and the lamp flickered. I don't know yet where I stand, he said. That's the honest answer. I know that I come on Thursdays because I want to, not because the wood needs stacking, and I know that I don't bring the coffee because of anything to do with the ranch accounts. He held her gaze, but I also know that whatever this is, I'm not going to push it faster than it ought to go. You've got enough to carry without me adding to it. Mara looked at him for a long time. "That's a careful answer," she said. "It's an honest one." She picked up her cup again. The coffee was still terrible. "All right," she said. "All right what?" "All right, I appreciate the honest answer." She paused. "And you can bring the coffee, but add it to the ledger." "Mara?" "Add it to the ledger," she said again, firmly. "I mean it. I'm not taking gifts I haven't earned." Everett picked up his terrible coffee and drank the rest of it without complaining. "Yes, ma'am," he said. From the corner where she had been supposedly asleep for the past 20 minutes, Nell opened one eye and looked at Everett with an expression of complete satisfaction, then closed it again. Neither adult mentioned it. The Women's Social Club order came through in the second week of December. 5 separate commissions from women who had apparently all received the same recommendation from Judith Ames and arrived at the cabin within 3 days of each other, staggered like an audition that had been coordinated without being acknowledged as one. Mara handled each of them the same way. Assessed the work, gave a price, set a timeline, produced receipts. No conversation about her personal situation. No gratitude that veered into pleading. No apology for being in the cabin or for the presence of the children or for the slight disorder of a workspace that was also a living space. She was running a business and she treated every customer like she expected them to understand that. 2 of the 5 became regular customers. One, a woman named Clara Briggs, whose husband ran the freight operation out of Red Hollow, came back not with mending, but with a proposal. Clara was organizing a cooperative order for winter fabric from a supplier in Cheyenne, and she wondered if Mara would want to put in with the group to get a better price. "What's the minimum order?" Mara asked. Clara told her. Mara did the mental arithmetic. "I'm in," she said. "I'll have the money to you by Friday." Clara looked at her, not unkindly, but with the particular curiosity of someone reassessing what they're looking at. "You've got that kind of capital already?" "I've been careful," Mara said, "and I've been saving since the first week." "Where do you keep it?" "In the lining of my winter coat," Mara said. "Sewn in." Clara laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her. "Of course it is," she said. "You sewed it in yourself." "Seems sensible," Mara said. After Clara left, Mara sat at the work table and looked at the ledger for a while. The numbers were good. Not comfortable. She was a long way from comfortable, but good. She was building something here, thread by thread, payment by payment, and it was beginning to have a shape she recognized. Ben came in from outside, his face red from the cold, and dropped onto the cot to pull off his boots. "Price says I can watch the training session tomorrow," he said. "The one with the new horses from the Hendricks property. He said I could stand at the fence." "Just the fence?" Mara said. "Just the fence," Ben agreed, without any indication this bothered him. "For now." Mara looked at her son. 6 years old, solid and quiet, with his father's dark eyes and something else entirely. Some patience that hadn't come from Thomas or from her. Some deep water stillness that the boy had simply arrived with, the way some people arrive with music or mathematics. "Wear your heavier coat," she said. "It's got a tear on the left cuff," Ben said. "I know." She was already reaching for her needle case. "Bring it here." He brought it. She repaired it in 4 minutes. He put it back on and went to the door. "Mama," he said. "Are we going to stay here?" She kept her eyes on the ledger. "I think we might," she said. "Okay," he said, and went back out. Okay, just that. Like a thing he'd been waiting for permission to believe, and now that she'd said it, he was done waiting and ready to proceed. It was Price who came to Everett on a Friday evening in the 3rd week of December, hat in hand, which Price did only when something had actually unsettled him. "You need to know something," Price said. They were in the barn. Everett was checking the feet on one of the older mares who'd been favoring her left front. He looked up. "The Hendricks boy was in town yesterday," Price said. "James Hendricks, the older one. He was at the saloon." He paused. He was talking about Mrs. Ellison. Everett set the horse's foot down carefully and stood up. "Talking how?" he said. Price turned his hat in his hands. He was a man who said things straight and didn't arrange them for comfort, which was why Everett trusted him. He was saying she didn't make her way here on her skills. He was saying she made it here the same way a woman always makes it when she's got nothing else to offer. Price's jaw tightened. Saying it loud enough for people to hear. Saying your name alongside hers. The barn was very quiet. "Who heard it?" Everett said. 7, 8 men, some of them ours." "Which of ours?" Price told him. Everett nodded slowly. "Did anyone push back?" "Danny said something, got a laugh from Hendricks for it." Price looked at him straight. "Everett, The woman has built something real here. She's done it right, and she's done it clean, and she doesn't deserve this kind of talk." "No," Everett said, "she doesn't." "So what are you going to do?" Everett thought about it. He thought about riding into town and finding James Hendricks and making very clear what happened to men who said certain things about women on Iron Creek Ranch business. He thought about how satisfying that would be for approximately 30 seconds and how much damage it would do after that, to Mara specifically, because a man defending her honor publicly was exactly the kind of thing that confirmed every story being told. "Nothing," he said. Price stared at him. "Nothing?" "Not me," Everett said. "She handles it herself, or it doesn't get handled. Anything I do makes it worse." He picked up his tools. "But I'm going to tell her. She has a right to know." Price put his hat back on. "She's not going to like it." "No," Everett agreed. "She's going to be furious." He went to the cabin that evening, not Thursday, and knocked. Mara opened the door. She took one look at his face and said, "Come in and tell me." He told her. She listened without interrupting. Lucy was at school still, late session. The teacher had added reading hours on Fridays. Ben was in the barn with Price, who had apparently anticipated this conversation and arranged to have the boy occupied. Nell was at the cabin, drawing something on a piece of scrap paper with a charcoal stick. When Everett finished, Mara was quiet for long enough that Nell looked up from her drawing. "What did James Hendricks buy at the dry goods last week?" Mara asked. Everett blinked. "What?" "He places an order there every month. Mrs. Conley mentioned it. Heavy winter work orders, equipment repair supplies." She was already moving to the work table. "Who does his mending?" I don't know. His wife, I assume. His wife left him in October. Mrs. Conley mentioned that too." Mara opened her ledger to a blank page. "He's been sending his mending to a woman in the next settlement, which means a 2-day delay every time." She looked up. "If James Hendricks becomes one of my customers, he has a financial interest in my reputation being good. People don't undermine things they depend on." Everett stared at her. "You want to take James Hendricks as a customer?" "I want to make him one," she said. "There's a difference." She wrote something in the ledger. "Will you take him a rate sheet?" "Mara, the man just—" "I know what he said," she said. "And I know why he said it, and I know the kind of man who says it. He said it because I'm a woman who's built something without needing his opinion of how I built it, and that bothers certain men." She set the pen down. "I'm not going to blow up his barn. I'm going to make him a customer, and in 6 months, he's going to be telling people I'm the best seamstress between here and Cheyenne, and he's going to forget he ever said anything else. And I'm going to let him forget, because I don't need his apology. I need the territory to understand I'm not going anywhere." She tore the page from the ledger, the rate sheet she'd just written out, and held it out to Everett. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You're a harder person than me," he said. "I've had more practice," she said. He took the rate sheet. Nell looked up from her drawing, completely unconcerned, and held it up for Everett to see. It was a picture of what appeared to be a horse, a woman, a man, and 3 small figures, all standing in front of a square shape that was probably the cabin. "That's us," Nell said helpfully. "I can see that," Everett said. "You're the tall one," Nell said. "Thank you," he said. He took the rate sheet and went to find James Hendricks, and if his expression on the ride into town was slightly more complicated than the errand required, there was no one on the road to notice. Mara sat back down at her work table and picked up the jacket she'd been hemming. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it counted. But she sat for a moment before she started, just a moment, and she let herself feel the particular exhaustion of having to be this careful, this calculating, this many steps ahead of every small cruelty. She was so tired of it. She was also, she realized, not as tired as she used to be. That was the difference 4 months made. Not that the world had become easier. It hadn't, not by much. But she'd stopped waiting for it to get easier on its own, and something about that shift, some internal rearrangement she couldn't entirely name, had changed the weight of it. She picked up the jacket and went back to work. Outside, through the window, the first real snow of December was starting. Not the sharp, angry hail of the storm that had brought her here, but the slow, deliberate kind, the kind that came and stayed. She watched it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she bent her head to the hem and kept going. James Hendricks sent his first mending order to the cabin 4 days after Everett delivered the rate sheet, and he sent it without a note, which Mara took as the closest thing to an apology she was going to receive and accepted accordingly. He was not the last person whose opinion of her shifted when money entered the equation. This was not something Mara found surprising. She had grown up watching her father manage relationships in exactly this way. Not through warmth, which he had in limited supply, but through reliability, through showing up and delivering and making himself useful until being useful was simply what he was. She had thought as a girl that this was a cold way to move through the world. She understood now that it was simply an honest one. December moved the way Wyoming Decembers did, with authority, without apology, turning the territory into a landscape of hard white ground and steel-colored sky that went on in every direction until the eye gave up trying to find the edge of it. The cabin stayed warm because Mara kept the woodpile restocked and the stove fed, which she'd been doing since the second week. Not because no one else would, but because she needed to know she could. The work continued to grow. By the third week of December, she had taken on a commission that was genuinely complicated. A wedding dress for Clara Briggs's niece, who was getting married in February and whose previous seamstress had taken a deposit and then moved to Denver without completing the work. The dress existed in pieces. The bodice cut but not assembled. The skirt panels basted but not sewn. The sleeves not yet begun. The girl. Her name was Anna. She was 19 and alternated between excitement and barely concealed panic in a ratio that shifted every time Mara saw her. Had brought the pieces wrapped in paper and set them on Mara's work table with the expression of someone surrendering a hostage. "Can you finish it?" Anna asked. Mara looked at the pieces for a long time. "The bodice is cut wrong," she said. Anna's face fell. "What?" "The side seams won't lie flat the way she's cut them. It'll pull across the shoulders." Mara held one piece up to the light from the window. "Did she take your measurements herself?" "Yes, twice." "She measured you wrong or she cut wrong. Either way, I'm going to have to recut the side panels." Mara set it down. "The skirt is fine. The sleeves I'll need to draft fresh. She hasn't touched them, and that's probably fortunate." She looked at Anna. "I can do it, but I need 6 weeks minimum, and I need you to come in for fittings. 3 of them, probably 4. 4 fittings? A dress like this, on a body that's been incorrectly measured, yes." Mara began making notes. "And I need the full deposit back from the other woman before we agree on my rate, because I'm not underpricing this." "She's in Denver," Anna said miserably. "Write her. Be firm. If she doesn't return it, that's between you and her, and my rate stays the same regardless." Mara looked up. "The dress will be right, Anna. That's what I can promise you." Anna looked at the pieces, then at Mara, with the expression of someone deciding whether to trust a stranger with something breakable. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She came back for the first fitting 2 weeks later and stood very still in the middle of the cabin while Mara worked around her, pinning and marking and murmuring numbers to herself that Lucy wrote down without being asked. The bodice fit differently now, correctly, which meant it felt strange to Anna because she'd been wearing incorrectly fitting clothes her whole life and didn't know what right felt like until Mara made her feel it. "Oh," Anna said softly when she looked at herself in the small mirror Mara had acquired from a ranch hand who'd won it in a card game and had no use for it. "It's not finished," Mara said. "Don't get attached to it yet." "No, Anna touched the side seam with one finger. "It actually fits." "It's supposed to fit," Mara said. "That's the point." But she understood the feeling. There was something in watching a thing become what it was supposed to be. Something in the material logic of it, the way the right cut on the right fabric behaved like a solved problem, that gave Mara a satisfaction she didn't try to analyze too closely. It was one of the few things she'd loved since she was a girl that the years hadn't altered or complicated. Everett came by during the second fitting, not knowing it was happening, and retreated immediately to the doorway and then the porch, and Mara could hear him waiting outside with the particular studied patience of a man who has decided to pretend a situation is not what it obviously is. She went out when she'd finished. He was sitting on the porch step looking at the sky. "Fitting," she said. "I figured," he said. "How's the dress coming?" "Better than it deserves to, considering where it started." He looked at her. "You could take on a helper. The work's gotten to that point." "I know." She leaned against the cabin wall. "I've been thinking about Agnes Pruitt." "Sims's widow?" "She lost the farm in September when the bank called the note. She's been staying with her sister in town. She can sew. I've seen her work at the church socials." She caught herself. "At the community gatherings. She's careful and she's fast and she has no income. You'd have to pay her from your own receipts. I know how business works, Everett." He almost smiled. "Right. The work has grown enough to support 2 people. Mara said, "and I'd rather give Agnes Pruitt a wage than watch her sister's patience run out and have Agnes end up where I was in August." Everett was quiet for a moment. "You know the town will talk about that too. You taking on another woman. Let them, Mara said. At some point, the talking has to run out of steam. In my experience, talking doesn't run out of steam. It just finds new fuel. Then I'll give it something worth talking about, she said. She went back inside to finish the fitting, and Everett stayed on the porch for a while longer, looking at the sky, which had gone the pale blue of deep winter and was absolutely cloudless and very beautiful. And he thought about a woman in a torn coat standing in front of a collapsing tent with a revolver in her hand, and how that woman had become, in less than 3 months, something he could not have predicted and wouldn't have believed if someone had told him. He thought about what he was going to do about that. He hadn't answered that question yet, but he was beginning to understand that not answering it wasn't a neutral position. Silence was a choice too, and he'd been making it long enough. Silas Renford called Everett into the main house on a Monday morning in the first week of January, and Everett knew from the way Silas was standing, at the window, hands behind his back, looking out at the yard, that something had changed. "Got a letter," Silas said, "from my nephew." Everett had known about the nephew in the abstract for years. Calder, Renford, Chicago, some kind of commercial interest, occasional mentions in letters that Silas read and set aside with the expression of a man tolerating something he hadn't chosen. He'd never met the man. Silas didn't talk about him if he could avoid it. "He's coming out," Silas said. "End of January." "What for?" Silas turned from the window. He looked older than he had in the fall. Not dramatically, just a degree of tiredness around the eyes that hadn't been there before. "He wants to look at the ranch. He's been writing about buying it for 2 years. I've been putting him off." He paused. "My health isn't what it was, Calloway. I haven't said anything because there wasn't anything useful to say, but I want you to know it now, because you need to understand why Calder thinks this trip might be different from the others." Everett stood very still. "How bad?" "Not dire, but my heart's been giving me trouble since October, and the doctor in Cheyenne says I need to think about the next few years rather than the next few months." Silas moved to his desk and sat down heavily. "Calder is my closest living family. He knows that. He's been patient, in his way." "What does he want to do with the ranch?" "Run cattle on a large scale, bring in outside investors, probably replace most of the current management with his own people." Silas said this without inflection, which was worse than if he'd said it with feeling. "He's not a bad man. He's a businessman. He sees what this land could produce at scale, and he's not wrong about the numbers." "He's wrong about everything else," Everett said. Silas looked at him. "I know that. I'm not disagreeing with you." He laced his fingers on the desk. "I want you to know what's coming so you can prepare. I haven't made any decisions, and I'm not going to make them fast just because Calder arrives with a checkbook." He paused. "But I also need you to understand that I might not be the one who gets to make the final decision. If my health gets worse, if there's a point where I can't manage it myself, the ranch goes to whoever I've legally designated, and right now the paperwork is old and it says Calder." The room was quiet. "What would you need?" Everett said carefully. "To change that paperwork?" Silas looked at him for a long time. "A reason?" he said. "A concrete one, not sentiment." Everett nodded once. "All right," he said. "I'm telling you this because you've spent 9 years on this land and you deserve to know what's standing at the edge of it." Silas picked up his pen. "Don't do anything foolish." "I won't," Everett said. He went back to the yard and stood in the cold for a few minutes thinking. Then he went to find Mara. She was at the work table when he knocked, Agnes Pruitt sitting across from her with a piece of work in her lap. Agnes had started 3 weeks ago, tentative at first. Then, with growing confidence, once she understood that Mara's method of teaching was simply to show the correct way once and trust that a competent person would follow. Agnes was a quiet woman, mid-40s, with the efficient movements of someone who'd run a household alone for years, and she and Mara had developed a working rhythm that required very little conversation and produced very good results. Everett looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at him. She began folding her work with the unhurried care of a woman who is not going anywhere unless she decides to. "I can finish the seam at home," Agnes said to Mara. "You don't have to," Mara began. "I know I don't have to," Agnes said pleasantly, and put on her coat and left. Everett sat down across from Mara. He told her about Silas and Calder. He told her about the health, the old paperwork, the nephew with the checkbook, and the plan. He told her the way he told her everything that mattered, straight, without arrangement, because she'd made clear early on that she wanted the information and not the cushioning around it. Mara listened. She'd put down her work. When he finished, she said, "When does he arrive?" "End of the month, maybe sooner if the roads are clear." "What's he like?" "I've never met him." "What does Silas say about him?" Not much, but the way he doesn't say much tells me something. Mara was quiet, turning her pen over in her fingers. The line cabin, she said. If he decides to clear the property, he doesn't own anything yet, Everett said. Nothing is decided. I know, I'm thinking ahead. She set the pen down. Everett, I need to understand something. If Calder comes and Silas decides to sell, not because he wants to, but because his health requires it, what happens to the ranch hands, to Price, to the men who've been here for years? Calder would bring his own people. The existing hands would get 2 weeks' notice, probably. Mara's jaw tightened. And you? I'd be the first out the door. I'm associated with the current operation. New management never keeps the old foreman. She was quiet again. The fire in the stove popped. Outside, Ben could be heard talking to someone, probably Price, who had begun the slow, deliberate work of teaching Ben the right vocabulary for what he already knew how to do instinctively. Has Silas thought about a purchase arrangement? Mara asked. Structured payments. You buy into the ranch over time rather than all at once. He'd have to be willing to hold paper on it. Would he? Everett looked at her. I don't know. Maybe, if I could show him the numbers made sense. The numbers do make sense, Mara said. I've been looking at the accounts for 2 months. This ranch is productive enough to service a structured purchase at a reasonable rate. It's not speculative, it's arithmetic. She opened her ledger to a page she'd marked with a strip of cloth. I've been running projections. I wasn't going to say anything because it wasn't my place. When has that stopped you? He said. She looked up. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the outline of one. The point is, I have the numbers. If you want them, they're here. If you want to take them to Silas before Calder arrives, that might be worth doing. You did this on your own, he said. Projection for a ranch purchase. I was doing the accounts anyway. It was a natural extension. She slid the ledger across the table. I also included a section on what a cooperative supply arrangement with 3 other ranches in the territory would do to Iron Creek's input costs. It's significant. He looked at the pages. The handwriting was small and precise, the numbers organized in columns that moved logically from one figure to the next. At the bottom of the last page, she'd written a summary in plain language. Not the language of someone showing off, just the language of someone who wanted the information to be clear. Mara, he said. It might not be enough, she said. Calder probably has a lawyer and a better offer, but at least Silas has something to look at besides sentiment. Everett closed the ledger. Can I show this to Silas? That's why I gave it to you. He stood up. He held the ledger and looked at her for a moment. You knew about Calder, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I knew Silas had a nephew somewhere, she said. I knew the ranch had no succession arrangement that made practical sense. I put it together when Silas started talking to you more and talking to me less. People get quieter when they're protecting information they think will upset you. She paused. I've been around enough careful silences to recognize them. You could have asked. It wasn't my information to ask for, she said, but I could prepare for it. He looked at her. Really looked, the way you look at a thing when you're finally letting yourself see all of it instead of the parts that are comfortable. You are the most prepared person I have ever known, he said, and I mean that without any qualification. Mara picked up her work. Go show Silas the numbers, she said, before Calder gets here. Calder Renford arrived on the 28th of January, 3 days earlier than expected, in a hired coach with 2 trunks and an expression of a man who has already decided what he's looking at and is merely here to confirm it. He was 43 years old, well-built, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having needed to be wrong about anything for long enough to learn the lesson. He wasn't crude, he wasn't loud, he was, in some ways, worse. He was pleasant and organized and completely certain, and his certainty had a quality of flattening everything around it into something that could be evaluated and assigned a price. He shook Everett's hand in the yard. Calloway, he said, Silas speaks well of you. Mr. Renford, Everett said. Calder looked around the yard, at the barn, the bunkhouse, the corral, and finally at the line cabin with its rate sheet still tacked to the door and Agnes Pruitt's coat visible through the window. Who's in the line cabin? He asked. A woman doing sewing work for the ranch, Everett said, and for some of the town. A woman. Calder looked at the cabin for a moment. On ranch property. On Silas's arrangement, Everett said. You'd need to ask him. Calder nodded, slowly, in the way of a man filing something away. I'll do that, he said, and went inside. He spent 3 days walking the property with Silas, taking notes, asking precise questions about productivity and costs and outstanding arrangements. He was thorough and he was smart and he noticed things. The repaired barn roof, the renegotiated supply contracts, the accounts that had been reorganized in November. On the evening of the second day, he came to Silas's study and asked about the accounts. "They've been redone," he said. "Reorganized. The previous system was more informal." "Mrs. Ellison reorganized them," Silas said, "in November." Calder's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Ellison is the woman in the line cabin?" "Yes. She has access to the ranch accounts." "She keeps them," Silas said. "There's a difference." Calder set down his notebook. "Uncle, she is a private citizen operating a sewing business on ranch property with access to the financial records of the operation. I don't know what arrangement you have with her, but from a business standpoint," Silas said, "the ranch has saved more in the last 2 months than it spent in the preceding 6, and I can tell you exactly where every dollar went, which I could not have said before November." He looked at his nephew steadily. "She earns her arrangement." "I'm sure she earns something," Calder said. The room went quiet. Silas looked at him for a long moment with an expression that had gone from tired to something considerably less forgiving. "Choose your next words carefully," he said. "That woman has 3 children." Calder straightened. "I meant no offense. I meant that the arrangement creates complications, legally, organizationally. If I'm to take over management—" "You haven't taken over anything," Silas said. "You've been here 2 days." Everett heard about the conversation from Silas the next morning, told in the clipped way Silas reported things he was angry about. He went to the cabin to warn Mara, but Mara already knew. Agnes had heard it from one of the kitchen women who'd been in the hall. "He's going to use the sewing business," Mara said, before Everett could say anything. "He's going to claim I've been operating a private commercial enterprise on ranch property without authorization." "You have Silas's arrangement, a verbal one, from November." She was standing at the work table, hands flat on the surface. "Nothing written. I should have pushed for something written." "Mara, don't tell me it'll be fine," she said. "I don't need that. I need to think." He stopped. Agnes, across the table, kept her head down and her hands moving, the particular tact of a woman who had decided that being present was more useful than being absent. Mara picked up her ledger. She opened it and turned pages until she found what she wanted. "Everything I've earned is in here, everything I've spent on supplies, every transaction with every customer, dated with receipts." She turned the book toward Everett. "I've been meticulous because I knew from the first week that someone might eventually want to tell a different story about how I got here." She'd known. Since October, she'd known that the documentation wasn't just good business practice. It was armor. "He doesn't just want to remove me," she said. "He wants to use me to pressure Silas. If Silas looks like he's made a foolish arrangement, it's easier to argue he's not fit to make decisions about the ranch." Everett sat down. That's correct," Mara said. "Isn't it?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "I think that's what's happening." "All right." She closed the ledger. "I need to talk to every person in Red Hollow who has a receipt from me. I need them to be willing to say publicly that they came to me, they paid a fair price, they received good work. I need this to look like what it is, a legitimate business that has been good for the community, rather than what Calder wants it to look like. That's a lot of people to approach." "Clara Briggs will help me," Mara said. And Agnes knows people I don't know yet." She looked at Agnes. Agnes finally looked up. "My sister-in-law sits on the county merchants committee," she said. "If a woman running a legitimate business is being threatened by an outside interest, that committee will have something to say about it." "That's useful," Mara said. "I thought it might be," Agnes said, and went back to her work. Everett looked at the two of them. Mara calculating, Agnes stitching, the whole thing running with the quiet efficiency of people who'd decided on a direction and were now simply moving toward it. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Keep Calder occupied," Mara said. "Show him everything he wants to see. Be useful and agreeable, and don't give him a reason to accelerate his timeline." She met Everett's eyes. "I need 3 days." "3 days," he said. "I can do that." He left. Agnes waited until his footsteps had cleared the porch before she spoke. "He'd go to the wall for you," she said. "I know," Mara said. "And you." Mara picked up the jacket she'd been working on before all of this started. "I'd go to the wall for myself first," she said. "That's the order that makes sense." Agnes nodded like this was the most reasonable thing she'd heard in a long time. Good, she said. Good. Let's start with Clara. The 3 days were the most exhausting of Mara's time at Iron Creek, and that was a high bar. She walked into town twice, Agnes once. Clara Briggs made 4 visits on Mara's behalf to women who had commissioned work, gathering signed statements that were not quite legal affidavits but were close enough to serve their purpose. The Merchants Committee was contacted through Agnes's sister-in-law and expressed its interest in the matter in a letter that Agnes said was as close to a threat as that committee had ever gotten without actually threatening anyone. Mara also sat down with Lucy. This was harder than any of the rest of it. Lucy was 8 and she understood more than she let on, and she'd been listening to the tension in the cabin for 2 days with the particular stillness of a child who knows that asking questions might produce answers she isn't ready for. "Are we leaving?" Lucy asked when Mara sat down with her on the cot. "I don't know," Mara said. "There's a man who wants to change things at this ranch. I'm working on making sure he can't change them as much as he wants. Because of us." "Because of all of it," Mara said. "Not just us. Everett, Price, and the hands who've been here for years. Agnes." She paused. "And yes, us too." Lucy looked at her hands. "I like it here," she said. This was not a complaint. It was a statement, offered carefully, the way Lucy offered things that mattered, like she was putting them on a table and asking Mara to look at them honestly. "I know," Mara said. "I like school, and I like that Ben's happy." She paused. "And I like that you're not scared anymore." Mara looked at her daughter. "I've been scared," she said, "this week." "That's different," Lucy said. "Before, you were scared all the time and you were trying not to show it. Now you're scared about something specific and you're doing something about it." She looked up. "That's different, Mama." Mara put her hand on the back of Lucy's head and held it there for a moment. "You're too perceptive for 8, she said. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true," Mara said. On the 3rd day, Calder made his move. He came to the cabin in the morning without Silas, which was itself a statement. He knocked with the brisk authority of a man who considers knocking a courtesy rather than a question. Mara opened the door. Agnes was not there. Mara had sent her to town that morning. The children were at school, all 3 of them, including Nell, who had started attending the lower class 2 weeks ago at the teacher's invitation, and had apparently been an immediate and disruptive presence. "Mrs. Ellison," Calder said, "I'd like to speak with you." "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the work table, at the ledger, at the receipts she had laid out in neat rows on the surface. She had done that deliberately last night, knowing this was coming. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "Please," she said. "Your arrangement here has been informal from the start. A verbal agreement with my uncle, no documentation, no defined term. In addition, you've been operating a commercial sewing business on this property, collecting money from customers outside the ranch without any formal authorization." He had clearly rehearsed this. Not the words exactly, but the tone, the management of it. "I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing on your part. I'm suggesting that the arrangement was poorly structured and that going forward, it creates complications." "What kind of complications?" Mara said. "Legal ones, liability, questions of property use. If I take over management of Iron Creek, I'll need all informal arrangements formalized or concluded." "Concluded," she said. "Yes." Mara picked up the top receipt from the pile on the table. "I have 47 signed receipts here," she said, "from customers in Red Hollow and the surrounding area, including 3 from neighboring ranch operations. Every transaction dated, every amount recorded. I also have a letter from the County Merchants Committee received yesterday expressing their interest in the business activity I've been generating in this territory." She set the receipt back down. "And I have a ledger showing that my supply purchases have circulated money back into Red Hollow's merchant community at a rate that the committee found, and I'm quoting here, considerably more significant than we had appreciated." Calder looked at the table. "In addition," Mara said, "my work has reduced Iron Creek's repair and equipment maintenance costs by an amount documented in the ranch accounts, which you've already reviewed." She paused. "I believe you said the accounts had been considerably improved since November." Something moved behind Calder's eyes. "You're very well prepared." "I've been preparing since October," she said, "when I first understood what I was building here and what it might need to withstand." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Ellison." "I don't know if that's true yet," she said, "but I'm not interested in being anyone's problem either." She met his gaze directly. I'm a legitimate business operating on a formal property arrangement with the owner of this ranch. I have documentation, community support, and a demonstrable financial contribution to this operation. If you'd like to formalize the arrangement further, I'm willing to discuss terms." She paused. "But I'm not willing to conclude anything." The silence stretched. "You should have been a lawyer," Calder said, and it wasn't entirely an insult. "I had 3 children to feed," Mara said. "I worked with what I had." He left shortly after without resolving anything, which was itself a kind of resolution. A man who came to deliver a conclusion and left without one. Mara watched him go through the window. When his figure had crossed the yard and entered the main house, she sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat on the table until they stopped. Then she looked at the 47 receipts laid out in their neat rows, and she thought about the tent and the storm and the revolver and the moment she'd lowered it. She thought about what it cost to be right and prepared and documented and still have to stand in her own cabin and argue for her right to stay in it. She was so tired of the argument, but she was still here, and Calder Renford had left without the conclusion he came for, which meant the argument, for now, had gone her way. Outside, she heard the sound she'd been half listening for. Horses coming in from the east pasture, Price calling something to one of the hands, and then a smaller voice she recognized as Ben's, asking a question about the gelding that had gone lame the week before. The answer came from Price, patient and specific, the voice of a man who had decided that teaching this particular child was something he wanted to do. Mara let out a breath she'd been holding, she realized, for most of the morning. She picked up her work. There was still a wedding dress to finish, and Anna was coming for her 3rd fitting on Thursday, and whatever Calder Renford decided about the ranch, the dress was going to be right. That much she could guarantee. That much was entirely hers. The corral gate swung open outside, and she heard Ben laugh at something. A real laugh, unguarded and full, the laugh of a child who had forgotten for a moment to be careful. And Mara bent over the dress and kept going. Calder stayed 4 more days after his visit to the cabin, and in those 4 days, he was scrupulously polite to everyone, which was somehow worse than if he'd been difficult. A difficult man gave you something to push against. Calder moved through the ranch like a man doing an inventory, pleasant and systematic, touching everything with his eyes and writing things in his notebook that nobody asked about and he didn't volunteer. He and Silas had 2 long conversations behind the closed door of the study. Everett knew about them because the kitchen woman, a stout, practical person named Berta, who had worked at Iron Creek for 11 years and had strong opinions about everything, reported the duration and the general temperature of each one without being asked. The first had lasted 2 hours, the second had lasted 40 minutes and ended with the sound of a chair being pushed back hard against the floor. On the morning of his 5th day, Calder had his trunks loaded into the hired coach and came to find Everett in the yard. "I'll be back in the spring," he said, "with my lawyer and a formal offer." "That's between you and Silas," Everett said. "Yes." Calder looked at him with the particular attention of a man reassessing something he'd previously decided. "You've built something real here, Calloway. I want you to know I recognize that." He paused. "It doesn't change the math, but I recognize it." "I appreciate that," Everett said in the same tone he used when he didn't appreciate it at all. Calder got into the coach. Through the window, he looked at the line cabin for a moment, one long look, and then the driver moved the horses and the coach rolled out through the gate and down the frozen road toward Red Hollow. Everett watched it go. Then he went to find Silas. Silas was in the study, not at his desk, but standing at the window, which was where he stood when something had used up most of what he had. He looked smaller somehow, in the way that men sometimes look smaller after a sustained effort. Not diminished exactly, but compressed, like something being held under pressure. "He's going to come back with a better offer," Silas said, without turning around. "I know." The first offer was already generous. The second will be harder to refuse on purely financial grounds. He turned then, and his face was tired in a way that went past the ordinary tiredness of a long day. "I'm 61 years old, and my heart misfires 3 times a week. I have a nephew who wants this ranch and the legal standing to press for it. And I have..." He stopped. "What do I have, Calloway? Tell me what I have on the other side of the scale." Everett had been thinking about this since January. He'd been thinking about what Silas had said, a reason, a concrete one, not sentiment, and about Mara's ledger pages and the projections she'd run, and about what it actually took to offer an aging man something better than money. "You have 9 years of a ranch that works," Everett said. "You have a foreman who can manage it without you standing over it. You have a woman who has turned a community relationship with this ranch into something that means the County Merchants Committee sends letters on your behalf." He paused. "And you have a proposal." Silas looked at him. A structured purchase, Everett said. Minority partnership to start. I buy in over time. Regular payments against a fixed price with the full operation staying intact and the current arrangements continuing. You don't need to choose between selling everything and keeping everything. You choose a third option. He reached into his coat and produced the folded pages from Mara's ledger. Not all of them, just the summary and the projections, which he'd had her write out separately for exactly this purpose. These are the numbers. Someone ran them carefully. Silas took the pages. He looked at them for a long time. Mrs. Ellison, he said finally. She said it was a natural extension of the accounts. Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had gone slightly differently. He kept reading. Everett waited. A log shifted in the fireplace. Outside, one of the horses made the particular complaint it made when it wanted to be fed and no one was moving fast enough. The supply cooperative, Silas said. She's already set up preliminary conversations? With 3 operations, they're interested. And the eastern pasture, this note about grazing rotation. He tapped the page. Did she calculate this from the accounts, or did she go out and look at the pasture? I honestly don't know, Everett said. Probably both. Silas folded the pages along their original creases and held them in both hands. He looked out the window at the yard, at the barn with its repaired roof, at the corral where Ben was doing his morning observing from the fence rail with the patience of someone who understood that what he was learning wasn't being taught on any schedule. You'd need a lawyer to draw it up, Silas said. A real arrangement, not a handshake. Yes, and Calder's offer will be higher than what you can pay me on a structured schedule. Almost certainly. So I'd be making a financial sacrifice. You'd be making a choice about what this place becomes after you, Everett said. That's different from a sacrifice. Silas was quiet for a long moment. I built this ranch because I wanted to build something that lasted, he said, not because I wanted to build something that sold. He set the pages on his desk. Get me a lawyer from Cheyenne, not Ames. Ames will talk to Calder before the ink dries. Someone from outside the county. I'll ride out this week, Everett said. And Calloway. Silas looked at him directly. Whatever this is with the widow, sort it out. I'm not saying it's a problem. I'm saying a man making a significant business arrangement should know what he's building toward. He turned back to the window, and I'm too old and too tired to pretend I don't know what I'm looking at. Everett picked up his hat from the chair where he'd set it. Yes, sir, he said. He went out. The wedding dress was finished on a Wednesday in the second week of February, 3 days before Anna's wedding, which left almost no margin and was nonetheless on time because Mara had calculated it that way from the beginning and built the schedule backward from the date, accounting for the 4th fitting that she'd known from the start would be necessary, even though she'd told Anna 3. Anna came to collect it wrapped in cloth and cried a little when she put it on, which Mara accepted without comment because some reactions were correct and this was one of them. It's exactly right, Anna said, looking at herself in the small mirror. I know, Mara said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. Clara Briggs, who had accompanied her niece, looked at Mara over Anna's head with an expression that mixed admiration and something more complicated. After Anna had carefully changed back and the dress had been rewrapped, Clara stayed. The merchants' committee letter, she said. It worked? It slowed him down, Mara said. He'll be back in the spring with a lawyer. Clara sat down across the work table. She was a direct woman, Clara. She'd built the freight operation alongside her husband and had taken it over completely when he'd broken his leg 2 winters ago and found, to everyone's mild surprise, that she was better at it than he'd been. What happens in the spring? Silas and Everett are working on an alternative arrangement. I don't know all of it. Mara put away her supplies with the methodical attention she gave to the end of every project. Needles sorted, thread wound properly, pins back in their case. I know the numbers support it. Because you ran the numbers. Because the ranch runs well. I just made it visible. Clara watched her. You know what the women in this town said when you posted that rate sheet in October? I can imagine. Some of it was what you'd expect, but there were others. Clara paused. Mrs. Hargreave told me she thought it was the clearest thing she'd seen a woman do in years. Public prices. No negotiation, no favors owed. Just, here's what I do. Here's what it costs. She leaned forward slightly. She said she wished she'd thought of it herself when she opened the mercantile. Mara set down the needle case. What are you telling me, Clara? I'm telling you that you've changed something here, Clara said. Not just the accounts at Iron Creek, something in how people think about what a woman can do when she has a reasonable starting point. She paused. Agnes is a different person than she was in December. Mara thought about Agnes. The tentative way she'd arrived at the work table that first day, the careful quality of her movements, like someone waiting to be told they were doing it wrong. The Agnes who now sat across from Mara and made decisions about her own work without asking permission first. Agnes was always capable, Mara said. She just needed a place where being capable was the point. Yes, Clara said. That's exactly what I mean. After Clara left, Mara sat at the work table for a while without picking anything up. The cabin had been quiet for a week. The frantic pace of the dress commission had wound down. The Calder situation had gone into a suspension that everyone understood was temporary, and the ordinary rhythm of the sewing work had settled back into something manageable. Agnes came 3 mornings a week. The orders were steady. Lucy kept the ledger with increasing confidence. Bond's world had expanded to the point where Price was teaching him to properly halter a young horse, and their conversations at the fence had become actual exchanges rather than the one-directional instruction of an adult and a child. Nell had decided she wanted to learn to sew. She was 4 years old and her hands were small, and her attention lasted approximately 6 minutes before redirected to something else. But she sat beside Mara on Tuesday afternoons with a piece of cloth and a blunt needle and a length of thick thread and made her small, irregular stitches with the absolute seriousness of a person engaged in important work. Mara had learned to work alongside her without comment, correcting only the grip and not the result, and this had produced in Nell the particular focused calm of a child who understands she is being treated as capable. "Am I good at this?" Nell asked one Tuesday. "You're learning," Mara said. Nell considered this. Is learning the same as good? Learning is better than good, Mara said. Good means you're done. Learning means you're still going. Nell thought about this for her entire remaining 4 minutes of focused attention, then put down the cloth and went to see what the dog was doing outside. Mara looked at the small square of linen with its uneven stitches. She put it in the box where she kept things she intended to keep. Everett came on a Thursday, as he always did, and this time he brought good coffee and also a letter from the Cheyenne lawyer confirming that he would arrive in Red Hollow the following week to discuss the purchase arrangement. He set both on the work table without making anything of either. Mara read the letter. She poured 2 cups of the coffee. She put the letter down. "He's coming," she said. "He'll need 2 days. Silas has agreed to the basic structure. Minority stake first, increasing over 5 years. Formal valuation next week." Everett picked up his cup. "It won't match Calder's number. That's just the truth. But it gives Silas what he actually wants. If what he actually wants is what I think it is, yes." Mara wrapped her hands around her cup. The fire was steady. Outside, a hard wind was running along the side of the cabin in the particular way it had on February evenings, finding every small gap and testing it. "Silas told you to sort things out," she said. Everett looked up. "He told you that?" "He told me something similar," Mara said. "In his way. He came to the cabin 2 weeks ago when you were in town. He asked how the accounts were going. We talked for about 20 minutes. At the end, he said," she paused, remembering it exactly, "a man who's building towards something generally wants to know what's at the other end of the road." Everett was quiet. "He's not subtle," Mara said. "No," Everett agreed. "He isn't." The fire shifted. The wind found a new gap and tested it. Agnes had left 2 hours ago, and the children were in the back of the cabin. Lucy reading, Ben sleeping already, Nell doing something with a piece of rope that she'd explained at length and that Mara had mostly followed. "I have something to ask you," Everett said. "All right." It's not, he stopped, started again. "There's something I want to know first, before I ask anything else." He set down his cup. "When you came here, when I brought you and the children that first night, what did you think this was?" Mara looked at him. "I thought you felt sorry for us," she said. "I thought you were a decent man doing a decent thing, and that I needed to make sure I didn't mistake decency for anything else, because I couldn't afford to be wrong about it." "When did you stop thinking that?" She was quiet for a moment. "When you went to Silas the next morning," she said. "Not because he asked you to, because you decided it was the right thing to do, and you did it without making me ask." She paused. "Men who feel sorry for people usually need the people they're sorry for to be grateful in a particular way. You never needed that." Everett looked at her steadily. "Mara, I need to know something. What do you want? Not what's practical, not what makes sense. What do you actually want?" She was quiet for long enough that the fire settled and the wind made its sound along the wall. "I want this to be real," she said. Not an arrangement, not something I owe you or you owe me, not something that started because I had nowhere else to go. She met his eyes directly. I want to have chosen it, and I want you to have chosen it, for reasons that don't have anything to do with the storm. It doesn't have anything to do with the storm, he said. Not anymore. Then what does it have to do with? He thought about it, actually thought in the way she'd come to know he did, taking the time that the question required rather than reaching for the first available answer. You, he said. The way you operate, the way you think. The way you walked into that dry goods with your receipts and didn't ask anyone to like you, just told the truth and let it stand. He paused. The way you argued with Calder Renford and weren't afraid of him, even though you were. He looked at her. I've been around a lot of people who work hard. I haven't been around many who think as clearly while they're doing it. Mara looked at him for a long time. That's a very unusual thing to say to someone, she said. It's what's true, he said. She nodded slowly, once, the way she nodded when she'd heard something she was going to put in the box with Nell's uneven stitches. I'm not ready to decide anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. There are things that still need to settle. I know. And I have 3 children, and any decision I make involves them, and that takes time that I'm not going to apologize for. I'm not asking you to apologize for anything, he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. He picked up his cup again. I just wanted you to know where I stand, so you're not working with incomplete information. Mara almost smiled. You know me well enough to know that would bother me. I've been paying attention, he said. They sat for a while after that without filling the silence, which was its own kind of answer. The lawyer from Cheyenne, a thin, careful man named Alderton, who wore 2 pairs of spectacles and kept the second pair in his breast pocket, as though the first might be subject to sudden failure, arrived on a Tuesday and spent 3 days at Iron Creek going through documents with Silas and Everett and emerging each evening with the expression of a man who has seen worse, but is not prepared to say by how much. On the 3rd day, he came to the cabin. Mara had been expecting this and had the accounts organized accordingly. Not all of them, just the relevant sections, with a summary page at the front that she'd written in the same plain language she'd used on the projection she gave Everett. Alderton read the summary page. Then he read the accounts behind it. These are thorough, he said. Yes, Mara said. You keep them yourself? Since November. He looked at her over the first pair of spectacles. Mr. Calloway's purchase arrangement, if it proceeds, you'll continue keeping the accounts? That would be between Mr. Calloway and Mr. Renford, Mara said. But if they asked? Then yes, she said. I would. He nodded, made a note, and left. She never found out exactly what he said to Silas and Everett that evening, but the following morning Silas came to the cabin himself, which he had not done since November. He knocked. She opened the door. He stood on the porch and looked at her with the particular look of a man who has made a decision and is now assessing whether he's made it correctly. I'm going forward with the arrangement, he said. Everett buys in over 5 years. Formal valuation Thursday. He paused. I wanted you to know. Thank you, Mr. Renford, she said. You'll keep the accounts, he said. Formal arrangement this time. Written. Another pause. And compensated accordingly. What you've been taking isn't what it's worth. Mara looked at him steadily. I've been taking what we agreed. The agreement was wrong, he said, in the tone of a man who does not enjoy admitting this and is not going to repeat it. We'll fix it Thursday. He turned to go. Mr. Renford, she said. He turned back. This is a good ranch, she said. Everett will take care of it. Silas looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, like a thing that has been slightly out of true for a long time and has finally been corrected. I know, he said. That's why I'm giving it to him. He went back across the yard. Mara closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, and in the particular quiet of the cabin, Agnes not yet arrived, children at school, fire steady, work waiting, she let herself feel it. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more specific. The particular sensation of a decision that has been made correctly, when you've done the work to make it possible and the work has been enough. She pushed off the door and went to the work table. The coral incident happened on a Friday, 3 weeks after Alderton had gone back to Cheyenne with his papers and his 2 pairs of spectacles, and a commission that Mara gathered had been significant. Calder had written, The letter arrived Wednesday, relayed through Silas, that he was coming in late February with his lawyer and a revised offer, and that he expected a full accounting of any new arrangements affecting the property. Silas had written back that he was welcome to come and that his accounting would be provided. The tone of both letters, as Mara read them through Silas's relay, had the particular civil temperature of men who understand each other very well and are not going to pretend otherwise. The Friday was cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming cold that comes after a storm has cleaned everything and left the air sharp enough to taste. Everett had ordered the horses from the north pasture moved to the main corral. The temperature had dropped faster than expected, and the north shelter wasn't adequate for an extended freeze. And 3 of the hands were managing the move, pushing the animals in groups down the track from the pasture. Mara had come out to the yard for water, no particular plan, just the habit of the working day. Ben was at the fence rail, which was not unusual. He was watching the incoming horses, which were unsettled, not panicked, but unsettled, the way horses get when routine is disrupted and the cold has made them sharp and reactive. I was quiet and still in the way he was always quiet and still, reading them. Lucy and Nell had come out with Mara. Lucy was helping carry something from the storage shed. Nell had attached herself to Mara's side, which she did when the outdoor world had too much activity, and she was deciding whether it was interesting or alarming. The group of horses that came in last was 5 animals. Young ones, the Hendricks horses that had been added to the Iron Creek herd in November. They were fine stock, but they'd been moved 3 times in 2 months, and they were tired of it, and when the gate swung open with more noise than the hand intended, 2 of them shied hard, and one, a bay gelding that Ben had watched all winter, the one with the mended shoulder wound from a fence injury in December, broke from the group. It didn't bolt for the road. It turned into the yard. Everything happened in the compressed, simultaneous way that emergency always does. The hand shouting, Everett's voice from somewhere to the left, the bay swinging wide with its eyes white and its hooves loud on the frozen ground, and Nell's hand slipping from Mara's because Nell had taken a step toward the animal, the way very small children move toward things that are large and bright and alarming, with no sense yet of self-preservation. Lucy grabbed for Nell's coat and missed. The horse was 12 feet away and closing, and there was no time for anything that required thought. Mara moved, not toward Nell and away from the horse, toward both of them, directly into the path of the bay, because putting herself between her children and the animal was the only geometry that made sense. She did it without stopping to decide, the way she'd stopped the revolver without stopping to decide, the way she'd walked into Calder's office without stopping to decide. She spread her arms, weight low, and she said nothing. No shout, no sharp sound. Just her body, planted in the animal's path, and the stillness that she had watched Ben practice from a fence rail all winter. She didn't know if she was doing it right. She knew what she'd seen Ben do, and she did that, because it was all she had. The bay pulled up 6 feet from her. It was still trembling, ears back, breath coming in hard bursts, but it had pulled up. Its feet had stopped. Mara didn't move. She kept her weight even and her arms out and her eyes not on the horse's eyes. Ben had said something about that. She remembered it now, said it to Price one morning when he thought no one else was listening. But down and to the side, and she breathed slowly, deliberately, because if she didn't breathe slowly, she was going to shake. The bay shifted, moved its feet, made a low, unhappy sound. She stayed, 30 seconds, a minute. The horse's breathing slowed by degrees. Then it took 1 step toward her, not aggressive, just curious, the shift from fear to investigation, and put its nose forward and blew out against her sleeve. She heard someone behind her say something, very quietly. She couldn't make out the words. She reached up, the same way she'd seen Ben do it, slow and flat-palmed, and laid her hand against the bay's neck. It stood. Everett had come up on the horse's left. She heard him rather than saw him, heard the particular quiet of how he moved when he was managing an animal. And he took hold of the halter without any sudden movement, and just like that, the crisis was done. Or the visible part of it was done. Lucy had Nell. Both of them were against the fence rail, Lucy's arms around Nell, Nell looking at Mara with an expression that was equal parts terror and fascination. "Mama stopped the horse," Nell said. "I saw," Lucy said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Price was standing in the middle of the yard with his hat in his hands. The 3 hands behind him had gone very still. A kitchen woman had come to the back door of the main house and stood there watching. Everett led the bay past Mara toward the corral gate. As he passed, he looked at her. One long, complete look, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. She looked back. Then she went to her daughters, checked Nell for injury with quick, precise hands, found none, stood up, and said, "Go inside, both of you." "Mama," Lucy started. "Go inside," Mara said. "I need a minute." They went inside. Mara stood in the yard and breathed. Her legs were shaking. She'd known they would be. The shaking always came after, when the body finally understood what it had just done and wanted to have its say about it. She kept her feet where they were and let it happen because there was no one in the yard who wasn't already watching her, and she'd given up the pretense of not shaking in front of people several months ago. Ben came off the fence rail. He walked to her and stood beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. After a moment, he said, "You held your eyes down and to the side." "I remembered what you told Price," she said. "It was good," he said. Not praise exactly, more like assessment, honest and direct, the same way he evaluated everything. "You didn't make any sharp sounds. That was the right call." "I wasn't sure I was doing it right." "You weren't," he said. "Not exactly. You were too tense in the shoulders, but the bay could tell you weren't trying to chase it, and that was more important." He looked up at her. "You did the most important part right." Mara looked at her 6-year-old son, this old, patient, particular child. "Thank you," she said. "You should come watch more often," he said. "The fence rail is good in the mornings." "I have sewing in the mornings." "The afternoons are good too," he said, and went back to the fence. Silas had come out onto the porch of the main house at some point during all of this, and was standing there now, watching Mara with an expression she couldn't entirely read from this distance. After a moment, he went back inside without saying anything. Everett came back from the corral and stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he said. "My legs are shaking," she said. "I know, I can see that." "I don't know what I was doing," she said. "Not exactly." "Ben gave you notes. He said my shoulders were too tense." Everett looked at her for a moment. "You know what the hands are going to say about this." "I can imagine." "Price already looks like he's seen something he doesn't have words for," he said. "Price will find words," Mara said. "He always does." "Mara." His voice was different. She looked at him. "You walked into the path of a terrified horse. My children were there. I know, I'm not..." He stopped, started again. "I'm not criticizing it. I'm trying to say that I watched you do something that most people don't do. Not because they don't love their children, but because they can't get their body to move when the moment requires it." She thought about this. "I didn't decide to," she said. "I just moved." "That's what I mean," he said. They stood in the cold for a moment. The yard had gone back to its ordinary activity. Horses settled, hands moving, the crisis absorbed into the working day the way crises usually were, by being survived and then continued past. "Everett," she said. "Yes." "The question you were going to ask me," she said, "before Silas's announcement, before Alderton, before..." She gestured slightly toward the corral. "Yes," he said. "Ask it now," she said. He turned to face her. The cold was considerable, and neither of them was dressed for standing still in it, which made the moment feel real in a way that organized things don't. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, without softening it, without performing it. "I'm not asking you to need me," he said. "I know you don't, and I wouldn't want you to. I'm asking if you want to build something together, the ranch, a life, whatever it needs to be." He paused. "I'm asking if you want to marry me." Mara looked at him. The yard sounds continued around them. Horses, wind, someone hammering something at the far end of the barn. Nell's voice from inside the cabin asking Lucy a question that Lucy answered with the patience of a person who has been answering Nell's questions since before Nell could form them into words. "Do you want me?" she said. "Or do you want someone you can keep saving?" He didn't look away from it. He didn't soften it. "Mara, I stopped saving you before December," he said. "I've been trying to keep up with you ever since." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, who had come west with plans and a good heart and not quite enough of what the territory actually required. She thought about the tent and the 4 months and the revolver and the small, careful world she'd built from nothing. She thought about Nell's 4 minutes of focused attention and Ben on the fence rail in the morning cold and Lucy, who was too perceptive for 8. She thought about what it meant to choose something rather than to accept it. "Yes," she said. Not loudly, not with anything added to it. Just the word, which was all it needed to be. Everett didn't whoop or lift her off her feet or do any of the things that the moment might have invited if either of them were different people. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the cold yard of Iron Creek Ranch while the ordinary world continued around them exactly as it would continue tomorrow, with more work in it than either of them could account for. "We should go inside," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "Nell is going to ask a lot of questions." "I expect so." "And Lucy is going to have opinions." "She already has opinions," he said. "She's been having them since October." Mara almost smiled. She has, she said. They went inside, and the cold came with them briefly and then was shut out, and the cabin was warm and crowded with the presence of 3 children and a decision that had been made slowly and honestly and without anyone being rescued by it, which was, Mara thought, exactly the right way. Nell looked up from her rope project when they came in. She looked at Mara, then at Everett, then at their joined hands, which they hadn't released. "Are we keeping him?" Nell asked. "Yes," Mara said. Nell considered this with her full 6 seconds of focused attention, then nodded with the authority of someone who has approved an important motion. "Good," she said, and went back to the rope. Nell told everyone. This was not a surprise. Nell had been telling people things since she learned that words produce reactions, and she had never developed the filtering mechanism that most children acquire somewhere around the age of 5, and that Nell showed no signs of acquiring at 4. She told Agnes the following morning, before Agnes had her coat off, standing in the cabin doorway with the directness of a town crier. She told Price when he came through the yard at noon. She told the kitchen woman, Berta, with a detail and enthusiasm that Berta later described to the other hands as the most thorough announcement she'd received since the territorial governor had come through Red Hollow in the summer. What Nell said, specifically, was, "Mama and Mr. Calloway are getting married, and I approved it." Price, when he heard this, took off his hat and held it against his chest for a moment in the manner of a man receiving news he has been quietly hoping for and is not going to ruin by saying too much about. "Is that right?" he said. "I was there," Nell confirmed. "I saw the hands." "Well then," Price said, and put his hat back on and said nothing further, because some things don't require commentary. Mara heard about Nell's announcement campaign from Lucy, who reported it with the resigned accuracy of an eldest child who has long since stopped being surprised by what her youngest sibling does and simply tracks it as a matter of record. "She's told at least 4 people," Lucy said, "probably more by now." "I assumed she would," Mara said. "You're not bothered?" Mara looked at her daughter. "Are you?" Lucy thought about it in her careful way. "No," she said finally. "I just wanted to make sure you knew." "I always know with Nell," Mara said. That's both the problem and the relief. Everett's response to being told the ranch knew about the engagement, before he'd had a chance to mention it to anyone, was to look at Nell with an expression of resigned acceptance and say, "Thank you for the announcement." Nell beamed. "You're welcome," she said. Calder came back in the first week of March, as he'd said he would, with his Chicago lawyer and an offer that was significantly higher than the first one. He sat across from Silas in the study and put the papers on the desk and let the numbers do what numbers do when they're large. Fill the room with a kind of gravity that makes everything else feel lighter and less certain. Silas read the papers. He read them carefully, which Calder had expected, and he set them down and folded his hands on the desk and said, "I've made other arrangements." Calder's lawyer looked up from his own papers. "The ranch isn't for sale," Silas said. "Everett Calloway is buying in under a structured arrangement. Alderton and Cheyenne has the papers. They've been filed." He looked at his nephew across the desk. "I should have told you before you made the trip. I apologize for that." Calder was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quite anger, but the particular expression of a man whose certainty has encountered an obstacle it didn't account for and is rapidly recalculating. "Uncle, the offer I've put in front of you is generous," Silas said. "I know. It's a good offer. If I were selling, it would be the right one." He paused. "But I spent 30 years building something that works. Calloway has spent 9 years making it work better. And a woman I should have helped in August has spent 4 months making it make sense." He looked at the papers for a moment and then back at his nephew. "I don't want the number, Calder. I want the thing itself to continue. That's the only decision I know how to make." Calder's lawyer set down his pen. Calder looked at Silas for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at the yard, where, if he cared to observe it, Price was demonstrating something to a 7-year-old boy at the corral fence, while the boy listened with the complete attention of someone receiving information he's been waiting his whole life for. "The woman," Calder said. "Mrs. Ellison. Calloway's fiancée," Silas said. Something shifted in Calder's expression. "I see," he said. "I thought you might," Silas said. The meeting ended shortly after. Calder's lawyer gathered his papers with the professional neutrality of a man who has watched this particular kind of conversation before and knows that some negotiations end not because the number wasn't right, but because the person across the table isn't selling what the number is for. Calder shook Silas's hand at the door. "Take care of your heart," he said, and he meant it, which was the thing about Calder that made him complicated rather than simply wrong. He was not a bad man. He was a man with a particular way of measuring things that left out the measurements that mattered most to other people. "I intend to," Silas said. Calder walked to his coach. He paused in the yard and looked at the main house, the barn, the corral, the line cabin with its rate sheet on the door. Mara had replaced the original in February, rewritten in Lucy's neater hand, with an added line at the bottom for the cooperative fabric orders. He looked at it all for a moment with the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain, for the first time, whether what he was being told he'd missed out on was actually worth what he'd calculated it was worth. Then he got in the coach and it rolled out through the gate, and this time it did not come back. Mara heard about the meeting from Everett that evening, told in the direct way he told her things. She listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then was quiet for a while. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he said. She nodded, set down the account book she'd been holding, looked at the fire. "I spent 4 months waiting for something to end what we'd built here," she said. "Every time something got stable, I'd lie awake running through the things that could break it." She paused. "I should tell you that. Since we're building something together, you should know that about me. I'm not good at trusting stability." "I know," he said. "I've watched you." "Does it bother you?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to expect from him and would have been disturbed not to receive. "Sometimes," he said, "when I can see you preparing for something to go wrong and it's clear it isn't going to, it's hard to watch someone brace for a fall when the ground is solid." He paused. "But I also understand why you do it, and I'd rather have you honest about it than performing a confidence you don't feel." Mara looked at him. "Thomas used to tell me I worried too much," she said. "He meant it kindly, but what he meant was that he wanted me to stop, because my worry made his optimism feel less certain." "I'm not asking you to stop," Everett said. "I'm asking you to tell me when it's happening so I'm not working against something I can't see." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable request," she said. "I thought so," he said. From the back of the cabin, Nell's voice. "Are you 2 talking about feelings again?" "Go to sleep, Nell," Mara said. "Okay," Nell said, without any indication she intended to. The wedding was in the first week of April, when the ground had gone from frozen to merely cold and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun the tentative process of leafing out, each bud small and yellow-green and provisional, the way beginnings always are before they commit. It was not a large ceremony. Mara had not wanted a large ceremony, and Everett had not wanted one either, which was one of the many ways in which they had found themselves in agreement without having to negotiate it. Silas stood up with Everett. Agnes stood up with Mara. Clara Briggs came. Price came and brought 4 of the hands who had been at Iron Creek long enough that not inviting them would have been an insult. Judith Ames came, which surprised Mara, though it probably shouldn't have. Judith had become a regular customer in February and had, in the quiet way of practical women who revise their positions without making speeches about it, become something closer to an ally. Anna came with her husband, who had been married now for 6 weeks, and who looked at Anna the way young husbands look at their wives when the reality of the thing is still slightly astonishing to them. The ceremony was held at the ranch, in the yard, because the yard was where the life was. Lucy stood beside Mara in a dress that Mara had made for her from the leftover wool of the cooperative winter order. Deep blue, well-fitted, with careful stitching at the cuffs that Lucy had done herself under Mara's instruction, and that was, objectively, better than anything Lucy had produced in her Tuesday afternoon session so far. She was proud of it, and she wore the pride quietly, which was how Lucy wore most things. Bun carried the rings on a piece of folded cloth, walking with the deliberate care of someone managing something breakable. He was 7 now. His birthday had been in March, observed with a modest meal and a gift that Price had contributed, a worn but functional knife in a leather sheath that Ben had immediately and permanently attached to his belt, as though it had always been there. Nell walked between Mara and Everett, holding a hand of each, because she had decided at some point in the preceding week that this was the correct position, and no one had successfully argued her out of it. When the officiant asked if there were objections, Nell looked around the assembled group with an expression of warning that produced a suppressed laugh from Clara Briggs and a perfectly controlled face from Agnes. There were no objections. Mara looked at Everett during the part where they made their promises to each other, and she did not look away from him, because this was a thing she was choosing with full information and open eyes, and she wanted that to be visible. He looked back at her the same way. When it was done and the papers were signed and Silas had shaken Everett's hand with something that was not quite emotion but was adjacent to it, Nell looked up at both of them and announced, "We're all married now." "That's more or less right," Everett said. "Good," Nell said, and went to find the dog. They moved into the main ranch house in May, when Silas retired to a smaller arrangement on the south side of the property. Not far, still close enough to appear at meals when he chose, which he chose with increasing regularity as the spring settled in and his health, though not restored, stabilized into something he could manage. Mara kept the line cabin. Not for herself. They were in the main house now, and the line cabin had gone back to being what it had been before the storm, a practical structure at the edge of the property, but she kept it stocked. Blankets, preserved food, firewood, children's clothing in several sizes, basic supplies. She and Everett had discussed it once, briefly. "The camp south of town," she'd said. "There are always people there. Some of them are where I was in August." "I know," he said. "No one should have to spend 4 months in a tent with children when there's a structure 20 minutes away." "No," he agreed. "They shouldn't." "So we keep it stocked," she said, "and we let it be known that the first night is free for anyone who genuinely needs it. And after the first night? After the first night, we figure it out," she said, "same as anyone does." They had a sign made. Not elaborate, just a piece of pine with the words burned into it by the hand of a man in Red Hollow, who did that kind of work and who charged a fair price for it and who Mara paid without adjustment because she had never haggled a fair price in her life and wasn't going to start. The sign said, "Rest first, decide tomorrow." Everett hung it above the cabin door on a Tuesday morning in June, which was an ordinary morning with nothing particular to recommend it, and Mara stood in the yard and looked at it and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. It wasn't happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. It was something more specific, the feeling of a thing that has been a long time becoming and has finally become. "Straight?" Everett asked from the ladder. She looked. The sign was slightly left of center. "Move it right a quarter inch," she said. He moved it. "Now it's right of center," she said. He looked down at her. "It looked straight before," he said. "It was left," she said. "I'll get a level." "You don't need a level," she said. "Try the middle again." He moved it back. She looked at it for a long moment. "That's it," she said. "It's exactly where it started," he said. "It looks better now," she said. He climbed down from the ladder and stood beside her and looked at the sign. He did not argue the point. He had been married for 2 months and he had learned, as all husbands eventually learn, that certain discussions have only one possible useful conclusion. "It looks good," he said. "It does," she agreed. The letter from Calder came in July. Not a legal letter. No lawyer's name at the top. No formal address. A personal letter, 3 paragraphs written in a clean hand that suggested a man who'd been taught penmanship and still practiced it. He wrote that he had purchased a cattle operation in Nebraska, which was going well. He wrote that he had thought about what Silas said and wanted to acknowledge that he understood it better now than he had in the study in March. He wrote that if Everett Calloway's operation ever wanted to discuss a commercial supply arrangement, he had contacts with buyers in Chicago who were looking for consistent quality from independent ranches. The offer was genuinely open, no obligations attached. At the bottom, he had written a single additional line. "Tell Mrs. Calloway her numbers were correct. I checked them." Mara read the letter twice. Then she set it on the desk and went back to the work table where a commission was waiting. Everett read it that evening. "He's not wrong to have checked," Mara said. "No," Everett agreed. "The Nebraska supply connection might be worth pursuing. Not now, maybe in 2 years. I'll write back," he said. "Be cordial," she said. "He's not a villain." "I know," Everett said. "He was just wrong about what mattered." "Most people are," Mara said, "until something changes their arithmetic." Agnes hired a second helper in the fall, a young woman named Ruth who had come to Red Hollow with her mother after her father's death and who had walked to the line cabin one Tuesday with the specific quality of determination that Mara recognized because she had walked toward things with that same quality for most of a difficult year. Agnes assessed Ruth's existing skills in 20 minutes and put her to work on the simpler commissions, and by November, Ruth was handling an independent caseload. Mara had been thinking about what Clara had said in February, that something had changed, not just the accounts at Iron Creek, but something in how people thought about what was possible. She had been thinking about it without arriving at a conclusion, which was unusual for her. Most things she thought about until she understood them, and then she moved forward. This one kept opening onto more territory every time she looked at it. What she had built was not, in the end, a sewing business. Or it was a sewing business, but that was the surface of it, the visible shape. What she had actually built was a demonstration, a proof in the mathematical sense, a thing that shows that something is true by existing. She had been a woman with 3 children and nowhere to go and nothing to prove it with except what she could actually do. And she had done it, and the doing of it had produced something real. And the something real had made room for Agnes, and Agnes had made room for Ruth, and Ruth had a mother who could now pay her own rent in the boarding house on the south side of Red Hollow, rather than depending on a daughter who was depending on a stranger's charity. The chain of it was what she hadn't seen from inside it. She saw it from outside now, and it was both smaller and larger than she'd expected. Smaller because it was ordinary, practical, unglamorous. Thread and needles and ledger entries and the repetitive labor of showing up and doing the work correctly. Larger because ordinary things done correctly, by enough people, in enough succession, produce changes that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted from the start. She thought about this one November morning while she was walking back from the school. Lucy had started as a teaching assistant to old Aldridge, who was exhausted and grateful, and Mara had walked with her out of habit before turning back alone, the way she still did, the part that was hers. The road was cold and the cottonwoods had gone bare and the sky was the pale winter blue that meant more cold coming. She thought about Thomas. She did this less often than she used to and differently than she used to. In the first months at the cabin, she had thought about him with a complicated mixture of grief and anger and guilt about the anger, which was its own kind of exhausting. Now she thought about him more simply. He had been a good man with a plan that didn't work out, and he had loved her and the children honestly, and he had brought them west, and the west had not been what any of them expected, and something had been built from that anyway. He would not have expected it. She was not sure she would have expected it either, from inside August, from inside the tent, from inside the particular despair of being turned away from every door in a settlement and going back to a patched canvas roof and 3 children who needed her not to fall apart. The thing about not falling apart, Mara had learned, was that it didn't feel like strength while you were doing it. It felt like arithmetic. One more day, one more task, one more small thing done correctly. Strength was what it looked like from outside after enough time had passed that the days had accumulated into something you could see the shape of. She had not felt strong in August. She felt it now, and not because the world had gotten easier. It hadn't, not entirely. Everett's heart was in the right place, but he had opinions about supply agreements that she occasionally had to argue him out of, and Silas's health required watching, and the ranch always had more needs than it had solutions on any given day, and Nell was 4.5 and had entered a phase of asking questions that no adult had good answers to, and was unsatisfied with the answers they offered. But strength was not the absence of difficulty. Strength was what happened when you kept doing the work after you stopped expecting the difficulty to end. Mara had figured this out somewhere between October and now, and she wasn't sure she could have said exactly when, which seemed right. The important understandings rarely announced themselves. She turned off the road onto the track leading to Iron Creek and walked up toward the ranch. And when she came around the bend in the track, she could see the yard. And in the yard, she could see the morning's ordinary activity. A hand moving hay, Everett crossing from the barn to the supply shed with the particular walk of a man with something specific to do, and at the corral fence, because he was always at the corral fence in the mornings, Ben. How was 7 now, and the Hendricks gelding, the bay from the February incident, who had been integrated into the Iron Creek herd and who had developed an attachment to Ben that Price called professional and the other hands called something warmer, was standing at the fence rail with its nose an inch from Ben's shoulder, completely still, while Ben talked to it in the low, steady voice he used when he was explaining something he considered important. Mara stopped on the track and watched them for a moment. She thought about the pig on her father's farm, the sow who had let a 3-year-old Ben sit beside her piglets while every adult kept their distance. Her father saying it was a nuisance. The particular injustice of a talent being called inconvenient by people who didn't understand what they were looking at. Ben had a gift. She had known it before she had words for it, had known it the way mothers know the specific gravity of each child, the particular weight of who they are and what they're for. She had spent a year making sure that gift had room to exist, had spent a year making sure there was a fence rail and a morning to sit on it, and a man like Price who understood what he was seeing and valued it. That was the work she wouldn't have known to name in August. Making room. Not just for herself, not just for practical survival, but for the things the children were becoming. The directions they were already moving in, long before Red Hollow, long before the tent, long before Wyoming. Lucy's precision and her capacity for patience. Ben's impossible stillness and his fluency with frightened things. Nell's absolute certainty that the world would accommodate her if she simply stated her requirements clearly enough, which was, Mara had come to think, not entirely wrong as a philosophy. She had made room for those things to grow. That was what she had actually built. Everything else, the ledger, the business, the accounts, the arranged marriage between Everett Calloway and the future of Iron Creek Ranch, all of that was real and she was proud of it, but it was the frame. The children were the thing inside the frame. She walked the rest of the way up to the yard. Everett came out of the supply shed as she came through the gate and looked at her with the look she'd come to know as his morning look. The one he hadn't been wearing in October because she hadn't been there yet and he hadn't needed it. Specific, present, aware of her in the particular way that people are aware of people they've chosen. Good walk, he said. Cold, she said. Coffee's on. I know, she said. You always have coffee. You noticed, he said. I notice everything, she said. You know that. She went inside and the coffee was on and the cabin was warm and Nell was at the work table with her piece of cloth and her blunt needle, making her small, irregular stitches with the absolute seriousness of a person engaged in important work. Mama, Nell said without looking up. What? I made a buttonhole, Nell said. Mara hung up her coat and went to look. It was not a buttonhole. It was an irregular oval with threads pulled in too many directions and one side longer than the other. But it had been attempted with full commitment, and commitment counted for a significant portion of the total. That's a start, Mara said. Nell looked up. Is it good? It's learning, Mara said, which is better. Nell nodded, satisfied, and went back to work. Years later, when people in Red Hollow and the surrounding territory talked about Mara Calloway, in which they did, in the way communities talk about people who have changed the texture of a place without making speeches about it. They usually started with the sewing and worked outward from there. The business, the workshop, the women she had employed. Agnes Pruitt, who eventually bought out Mara's share when Mara's time went fully to the ranch accounts. Ruth, who trained 2 more women after her. Clara Briggs, who credited Mara with the idea for the cooperative purchasing arrangement that eventually involved 11 operations across the territory. Some people talked about the corral incident, the February morning with the bay gelding. And it accumulated the particular weight that incidents accumulate when they're retold enough times, growing slightly in the drama of each retelling while staying essentially true at the center. A few people who had been in Red Hollow in the fall of 1876 remembered the rate sheet on the cabin door. 47 cents to mend a work shirt, 65 for trousers, full garment construction bias estimate, no negotiation. Fixed prices, public, available to anyone, no relationship required. It was such a small thing. It was also, in its way, a statement about how Mara Ellison intended to be treated. Not as a charity case, not as a woman whose circumstances licensed people to offer her less than fair value, but as a person with a skill and a price and a right to name both without apology. Red Hollow had taken a while to read the statement correctly, but it had read it. Lucy became the settlement school's teacher in her 20s, after Aldridge retired to his daughter's house in Cheyenne, and she taught in the same room for 30 years. She was a precise and patient teacher who had high expectations and communicated them without condescension, which her students found slightly alarming at first and deeply useful after. When people asked where she'd learned to teach, she said she'd been watching her mother manage people since she was old enough to watch. Ben left Red Hollow at 19 to work with a horse trainer in the southern part of the territory whose reputation was significant and whose assessment of Ben, after watching him work for one afternoon, was that he'd learned more than he was going to be able to teach him, which he said with generosity rather than resentment, because good teachers know the difference between a student who needs more instruction and a student who needs more space. Ben came back to Wyoming 10 years later with a reputation of his own and a small operation that became, in time, one of the most respected training facilities in the territory. Price, by that point elderly and partially retired, came to watch Ben work once and was observed afterwards sitting alone on the fence rail for a long time, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. Nell never lost the quality of stating her requirements clearly and expecting the world to accommodate them. This worked out better for her than it probably should have, which Mara attributed to the fact that Nell had the good sense to make her requirements reasonable before stating them loudly, and that this was a more sophisticated strategy than it appeared. Silas Renford lived to 74. I was present at Lucy's first day as school teacher and at Ben's return to Wyoming and at the birth of Mara and Everett's first child together, a girl they named after no one in particular and who arrived with the specific opinion that the world owed her more attention than it was currently providing, an opinion she shared continuously and at volume until provided with it, which Nell observed was clearly hereditary and which Mara declined to comment on. Iron Creek Ranch grew. Not dramatically, not the commercial scale Calder had envisioned, but solidly, sustainably, in the way of things built by people who intend to still be there in 20 years. Everett completed his purchase arrangement on schedule. The partnership with Calder's Nebraska contacts materialized 2 years after the letter, as Mara had predicted it would, and proved useful without becoming dependent, which was the only kind of useful Mara had ever trusted. And the lined cabin at the edge of the property stayed stocked. Blankets, preserved food, firewood, children's clothing in several sizes, basic supplies. The sign above the door faded now from the weather and replaced twice, once in 1879, once in 1884, but always the same words in the same plain lettering on the same piece of pine. Rest first, decide tomorrow. Mara remembered everyone who used it. Not because she kept a formal record, she didn't. She had decided early that keeping a record would change the nature of the thing, make it transactional in a way she didn't want, but because she paid attention, and paying attention was its own kind of record. A woman with 2 children in the autumn of 1877, 3 weeks, found work at the Mercantile, moved to town. A family of 4 in the winter of 1878, 5 nights, continued west in the spring. A young man alone in the summer of 1880, one night, left before anyone woke, which was his right. Several others over the years, whose situations she knew to varying degrees and whose subsequent lives she knew or didn't, who had been the point and whose success or difficulty was not something she could control and had never been. What she could control was the door being open. What she could control was the woodpile being stocked and the food being there and the sign being readable, and the first night being free. Without question, without application, without requiring anyone to explain themselves to a committee that might decide they weren't the right kind of need. She thought about herself in August of 1876, standing in front of Mrs. Hargreave at the Charity Committee's meeting, explaining the situation with the precision of a woman who believed that if she made the facts clear enough, the response would be adequate. The committee had listened carefully and told her with genuine regret that they didn't have capacity. She had not blamed them. She did not blame them now. They were doing what they could with what they had, which was all anyone did. But she had sat outside afterward, on a bench in the sun, and thought, if I get through this, I'm going to make sure the structure exists, not the goodwill. Goodwill ran out. The structure, the stocked cabin, the open door. The first night, free, unconditional, available before anyone has to articulate what they need or prove they deserve it. She had gotten through it. She had built the structure. One evening in the late summer, the children grown, Everett reading by the lamp, the ranch yard gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet after a long productive day when everything that needed doing had been done. Mara sat on the porch and looked at the road. She was thinking, as she sometimes did, about the storm, about the tent rising into the air and cartwheeling into the cottonwoods, about the revolver and the moment she lowered it and what that moment had required of her. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the willingness to make a different calculation, to look at her children's faces and decide that the thing she was most afraid of was not standing in front of her on a horse. She had been raising 3 children in a tent, and a cowboy had stopped on the road and said they were sleeping under a roof that night, and she had made the decision that changed everything by putting down a gun she hadn't wanted to pick up in the first place. But here was the thing she had understood more clearly as the years went on. The cowboy stopping was not the story. The cowboy stopping was the beginning of a story that she had written every day since, in receipts and ledger entries and fittings and conversations and small, precise decisions made under pressure. Everett had opened the door. She had decided what to build inside it. Those were 2 different acts, and both mattered, and neither one was sufficient without the other. The road was empty in the late light. The cottonwoods along the creek had the full summer sound they always had in August, a continuous, layered rustling that was the closest thing this territory had to quiet. She watched the road for a while. Then Everett came out and sat beside her on the porch step with his coffee, which was always good now, had been good for years, and which she had stopped pretending she didn't appreciate receiving. Watching for something, he said. No, she said, just watching. He sat with her. That was the thing she had learned about him. Across all the years, and the argument about supply agreements and the raising of children and the building of a ranch into something that would last after both of them. He knew when to ask and when to sit. He had known it the night of the storm, on the road, in the hailstorm, walking beside a horse and a woman with a gun. He had known it before she knew him well enough to know he knew it. Some people came into your life solving a problem. Some people came in and sat down beside it and helped you figure out that the problem was actually manageable, which was a different and in some ways more useful thing. The road stayed empty. The light moved across the field in the way late summer light does, slowly, completely, as if it intends to account for everything before it goes. In the line cabin, the wood pile was stocked, the door was unlocked, the sign was straight,